There are places on this planet that don't make sense. Structures built long before recorded history, yet still standing with precision. We struggle to explain stone cities hidden in mountains, chambers aligned with the sun, entire landscapes carved into rock across deserts, forests, and remote islands. These sites continue to exist, not as stories, but as real places, studied, measured, and still not fully understood. Because this isn't just about ruins, it's about how they were built and why. If that kind of mystery pulls you in, consider subscribing and leave a like to support the journey. Take a moment, settle in. The ancient settlement without streets. In central Turkey, on a flat plain that today feels open and quiet, there is a site that at first does not look like a city at all. From a distance, it appears as a low mound rising gently from the ground, shaped more by time than by design, blending into the landscape in a way that makes it easy to overlook. But beneath that mound lies something very different. This is Karalhoyuk. And what makes it unusual is not just its age, but the way it was built. Dating back to around 7000 BCE. This settlement existed at a time long before organized cities, long before streets, and long before the kind of urban planning we usually associate with civilization. And yet, what is found here challenges that expectation almost immediately. Because this a city without streets. The houses at Çatalhöyük were built directly next to each other, packed tightly in a continuous formation, sharing walls and forming a dense, interconnected structure. There are no visible roads running between them, no open pathways that separate one building from another. Instead, the rooftops functioned as the primary space for movement. People moved across the settlement by walking above it, entering their homes not from the side but from the top. Through openings in the roof, ladders led downward into interior spaces, creating a vertical transition from outside to inside rather than a horizontal one. And that changes everything, because it means the layout was not based on open ground. It was based on connection. The settlement becomes a single, unified structure, rather than a collection of separate buildings. Each house is part of a larger whole, and movement is guided across the surface rather than through it. Inside the houses, the space is carefully organized. Platforms line the walls, used for sleeping, sitting, and possibly for ritual activity. Hearths are positioned for cooking, and storage areas are integrated into the structure itself. The walls are often coated with plaster, and in some cases, decorated with paintings or symbolic features. And then there are the burials, because beneath the floors of these houses, human remains have been found, placed carefully within the structure itself. This suggests that the boundary between living space and burial space was not separate, but connected, which introduces another layer of meaning. Because now, the house is not just a place to live. It becomes a place of memory, a place where life and death exist within the same structure, and that reflects a different way of understanding space, not divided into separate functions as we see today, but integrated into a single environment where daily life, ritual, and remembrance all take place together. And then there is the scale of the settlement. Because Çatalhöyük was not small. At its peak, it may have supported thousands of people, all living within this connected system, all moving across rooftops, all sharing walls in a way that suggests both cooperation and structure. And that raises a deeper question. How was this organized? Because maintaining a settlement like this requires coordination, not just in building, but in living. Shared walls mean shared responsibility. Close proximity means constant interaction, and that suggests a social system that functioned differently from later cities. Less separation, more integration. A form of organization that does not rely on clear divisions between spaces, but instead creates a continuous environment where everything is connected. And then, over time, the settlement changes. Layers build upon layers. New structures are built on top of older ones, gradually raising the mound higher and higher. Each generation adds to what came before, not by expanding outward, but by rebuilding upward. And that process continues for centuries, until eventually the site is abandoned. Not destroyed, not suddenly lost, but gradually left behind. And over time, the structures collapse, the materials settle, and the entire settlement becomes part of the ground. Until it appears once again as a simple mound. Quiet, unremarkable, but holding within it a record of something far more complex. Because Charalhöyük shows a moment when human settlement took a different form, not based on streets and open space, not divided in the way we expect, but connected, integrated, built in a way that reflects a different understanding of how people live together. And even now, as the remains are studied and slowly uncovered, that structure becomes visible again. Not as a complete city, but as a pattern, a system, a way of living that existed long before the models we recognize today. And that is what makes it stand out. Because it doesn't just show that people lived here, it shows that they built something fundamentally different. Something that challenges the idea of what a city is supposed to be and leaves behind a question that is still being explored. Not just how it was built, but why it was built this way at all. The passage grave beneath the earth. In the landscape of western France, where low hills roll gently across the region and the ground carries the quiet weight of time, there is a structure that does not rise above the land in the way most ancient monuments do. It is almost hidden. At first glance, it appears as nothing more than a mound of earth covered in grass and shaped by centuries of wind and weather. There are no towering stones, no obvious walls, nothing that immediately reveals its purpose. But beneath that surface, there is structure. This is the Kerkado Passage grave, and what makes it unusual is not just its age, but the way it was built into the landscape itself. Dating back to the Neolithic period thousands of years ago, this structure belongs to a time when people began shaping the earth not just for shelter, but for meaning. And here, that meaning is placed below the surface, hidden within a carefully constructed system of stone and space. The entrance is small, a narrow opening that leads into a passage lined with upright stones, each one placed with intention, forming a corridor that moves inward through the mound. The ceiling is created by large slabs laid across the top, forming a continuous roof that holds the structure together. As you move through the passage, the space changes. It narrows. It darkens. Sound becomes quieter. Until the corridor opens into a central chamber. And this chamber is not random in its shape. It is enclosed, defined by larger stones arranged to create a contained space, almost circular, with a sense of balance that suggests planning rather than improvisation. The structure holds its form through weight and placement alone without the use of mortar, relying entirely on the positioning of the stones. And that immediately raises a question. Because building something like this is not simple. The stones had to be transported, positioned, balanced, and all of this was done without the tools or technology we would expect today. Which means the construction was not accidental. It required knowledge. Not only of how to move material, but how to arrange it so that it remains stable over time. And that stability is still visible, because even after thousands of years, the structure remains intact. The passage still leads inward. The chamber still holds. And that suggests accuracy. Not perfect in a modern sense, but precise enough to endure. And then there is the purpose. Because passage graves are most often associated with burial. And evidence supports that idea here. Human remains have been found within similar structures, placed carefully inside the chamber, often accompanied by objects that suggest a ritual or symbolic meaning. Which means this was not just a construction. It was a place connected to death, and possibly to memory. But even within that understanding, there are layers that remain unclear. Because the design goes beyond what is necessary for a simple burial. The passage is aligned. The chamber is shaped. The entire structure is covered by a mound that conceals it from view. And that suggests something more. Not just function, but intention. Because hiding a structure like this changes how it is experienced. It is not seen from a distance, it is entered. And that creates a transition from outside to inside, from light to darkness, from open space to enclosure. And that transition feels deliberate, as if the movement itself is part of the purpose. And then there is the question of alignment. Many passage graves across Europe are oriented toward specific points on the horizon, often connected to the movement of the sun during solstices or equinoxes. While the exact alignment of Kirkado is not as precisely defined as some other sites, the idea remains part of the broader pattern. Because structures like this were not isolated, they appear across regions, similar in form, similar in concept, which similar in suggests shared knowledge, or at least shared ideas. And that creates a wider context, because this is not just a single structure, it is part of a tradition, a way of building that appears again and again, adapted to different landscapes but following the same basic principles. And that consistency raises another question. How was this knowledge passed on? Because building something like this requires understanding that goes beyond a single generation. It requires continuity, a way of remembering, a way of repeating. And that implies communication, shared methods, shared purpose. And then, over time, the structure is no longer used in the same way. The entrance becomes less accessible. The mound settles. The space is left undisturbed. And gradually, the structure disappears from everyday awareness. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was hidden. And that may have been part of its design from the beginning. Because unlike structures meant to be seen, this one is meant to be entered. And once it is no longer entered, it becomes invisible until it is rediscovered. And then the structure appears again, not as a living space, but as a preserved form, a record of how people once shaped the earth to create meaning. And maybe that's what makes Kirkado stand out. Because it is not defined by what is visible, but by what is concealed. A structure that exists beneath the surface, holding its shape in silence, carrying a purpose that is only partially understood. And even now, standing above it, looking at what appears to be nothing more than a mound, it is difficult to fully grasp what lies beneath. But it is there, still intact, still structured, and still holding the form of something that was built thousands of years ago, with intention, and with a meaning that has not completely disappeared. The fortified hill settlement. On the Istrian Peninsula near the western coast of Croatia, there is a hill that rises gently above the surrounding land, overlooking a landscape of fields, forests, and distant sea. At first, it feels like many other elevated places in the region. Quiet, open, unremarkable. But this hill was not left untouched. It was shaped, built into something structured. This is Monkodonja. And what makes it unusual is not just its location, but the way the entire settlement was organized with a level of control that suggests careful planning from the very beginning. Dating back to the Bronze Age, around 1800 BCE, Monkodonja was not a scattered collection of houses, but a defined and fortified settlement, built with intention and maintained over time. The first indication of this is the wall, a massive stone fortification that encircles the hill, forming a boundary that separates the interior from the outside world. These walls are not small or loosely constructed. They are built from large stones, carefully placed to create a barrier that follows the natural shape of the terrain. And that immediately suggests purpose, because walls of this scale are not built without reason. They require effort, coordination, a shared understanding of what they are meant to achieve, which in most cases points to protection. But protection is only part of the story, because inside the walls, the space is organized, not randomly, but in a way that reflects structure. The settlement is divided into sections, higher areas, lower areas, with the central part of the hill likely holding the most important structures. And that division suggests hierarchy. Not all spaces were equal. Some areas were more significant than others. which reflects a society that was not uniform but structured, with roles and positions that influence how space was used. And that idea becomes clearer when looking at the entrances, because access, settlement was controlled. Gateways were built into the walls, creating specific points where movement was allowed. These entrances are not wide or open. They are designed to guide and limit access, forcing movement through narrow passages that could be monitored. And that changes how the settlement functioned. Because it was not just a place to live, it was a place that could be defended. A place where entry and exit were controlled. And that level of control suggests awareness of risk, of the need to protect what was inside. But even with that defensive aspect, there are details that go beyond simple protection. Because the layout inside the settlement shows signs of planning that is not strictly military. Paths connect different areas. Structures are arranged with intention. Open spaces appear where movement or gathering may have taken place. And that suggests daily life, not just survival, but routine. Activity that continued within the boundaries of the walls. And that means Monkodonja was not only a refuge, it was a living settlement, a place where people stayed, worked, and interacted over time. And then there's the question of construction. Because building with large stone blocks requires effort. The stones must be moved, positioned, fitted together in a way that creates stability. And that is not simple, especially without modern tools, which means the builders had methods, techniques that allowed them to handle material at this scale. And those methods were not used once, they were repeated across the walls, across the structures, creating a consistent system that holds together even now. And that consistency reflects knowledge, not just of material, but of how to use it effectively. And then there's the broader context, because Monkodonja is not isolated in time. It exists within a period where fortified settlements appear across different regions, each adapted to its environment, but sharing similar principles. Elevation, boundaries, control of movement. And that suggests a pattern, a way of thinking that appears in different places, shaped by local conditions but connected by similar needs. And then, over time, the settlement is no longer used. The reasons are not fully clear. Changes in population, shifts in resources, possible external pressures, all possible. But what remains is the structure. The walls still trace the outline of the hill. The layout is still visible, even as parts of it have softened with time, and that creates a quiet kind of presence. Because the form of the settlement is still there, not fully intact, but enough to understand what it once was. A place that was built with intention, organized, defended, and maintained long enough to leave a clear mark on the landscape. And maybe that's what makes Monkodonja stand out. Because it shows a moment when human settlements began to take on a different form, not just places to stay temporarily, but places designed to last. With structure, with boundaries, with a system that defines how people live within it. And even now, standing on that hill looking out across the surrounding land, the outline of that system is still visible. Not as it once was, but enough to suggest that something organized existed here, something built with purpose, and something that remains, even after the people who created it are gone. The stone tower in the water. In the Shetland Islands, where the land meets the North Sea under shifting skies and constant wind, there is a structure that stands in a place that feels both open and isolated at the same time. It rises from the edge of a loch, surrounded by water, connected to the land by a narrow strip that feels almost accidental, as if the location itself was chosen to create distance from everything around it. This is the Brach of Klickman. And at first, it doesn't appear complex in the way large cities or monumental ruins do. It is a tower, built from stone. But the more you look at it, the more its structure begins to reveal something different. Because this is not just a simple tower, it is a double-walled structure, built with an inner and outer layer of stone, creating a hollow space between them. This design is not immediately visible from the outside, but it becomes clear through excavation and study. And that detail changes everything, because building in this way requires planning. not just stacking stone upward, but creating a system within the walls themselves, possibly for stability, insulation, or even movement through internal passages. And that suggests a level of understanding that goes beyond basic construction. The tower itself rises from a base that is integrated into the surrounding landscape, using the ground and the water as part of its design. The position is not random, it is controlled, because being surrounded by water creates separation. It limits access. It defines boundaries, and that is often associated with defense. But defense alone does not fully explain the structure, because inside the tower there is space, rooms, areas that suggest habitation, which means this was not only a place to protect, it was a place to live. And that creates a dual purpose, a structure that functions both as a residence and as a fortified position. And that combination is not simple to achieve. Because it requires balancing two needs: security and usability. And that balance is reflected in the design. The walls are thick. The entrance is narrow. Movement into the structure is controlled. And yet, once inside, the space opens enough to allow activity, which suggests that the people who built it were not only concerned with protection, but with maintaining a functional environment within those boundaries. And then there is the broader context, because brocks are not unique to this single location. They appear across parts of Scotland, particularly in the northern regions, each with variations in design but sharing similar principles. Stone towers, double walls, controlled entrances. And that repetition suggests a shared idea, a method that was understood and applied in different places. But Clickaman has something additional, because it is not just a broch. It is a broch within a larger system. There are outer walls, additional defensive features, structures that surround the central tower, and that creates layers, an outer boundary, an inner core, which increases the level of control. Because now access is not defined by a single barrier, but by multiple stages. And that makes the site more complex, more structured, and possibly more significant. Because building at this level requires effort beyond what is needed for a simple dwelling. It suggests importance, a place that holds value, whether strategic, social, or symbolic. And then there is the question of time, because the broch of Clickaman dates back to the Iron Age, roughly around the first millennium BCE. And during that period, societies in this region were developing forms of settlement that combined local materials with evolving techniques. Stone was the primary resource, and here it is used with precision. Each block placed carefully, each layer contributing to the overall stability of the structure. And that precision is still visible, because despite centuries of exposure, the tower remains, partially intact, but clearly defined. And that endurance reflects something important, because whatever method was used to build it, it worked, not just for a short time, but for generations. And then, eventually, the site changes. Its original function fades. The people move on. The structure is no longer maintained in the same way. And what remains is the form, the tower, the walls, the outline of something that once had a clear purpose. And that creates a different kind of presence. Because standing there now, the structure does not feel abandoned in the usual sense. It feels defined. As if the intention behind it is still visible, even if the details are no longer fully known. And maybe that is what makes the broch of Clickaman stand out, because it shows a way of building that is both practical and deliberate, a structure that integrates environment, material, and purpose into a single form. And even now, as the water remains around it and the land stretches outward beyond, the tower continues to hold its place, not as it once was, but enough to suggest what it once meant: a place of control, a place of structure. The stone fort on the hill. In the countryside of southeastern Ireland, where low hills rise gently above the surrounding farmland, there is a site that from a distance looks like a natural feature of the landscape, a circular shape, subtle, blending into the ground. But as you move closer, the pattern begins to reveal itself. Stone, arranged, deliberately. This is Rathgall. And what makes it unusual is not just its form, but the scale at which that form was created. Because this is not a single wall or a simple enclosure, it is a series of concentric stone ramparts built in circular layers that surround the hilltop, creating a structure that expands outward in a controlled pattern. And that pattern is not random. Each ring follows the curve of the hill, maintaining distance, maintaining shape, forming a structure that feels organized from the beginning rather than added over time without direction. And that immediately suggests planning, because building in circles at this scale requires control. You need a center, you need consistent spacing, you need coordination across the entire structure, and maintaining that across multiple layers increases the complexity. Which means this was not improvised, it was designed. The ramparts themselves are constructed from stone gathered from the surrounding area, placed to create walls that define the boundaries of each ring. Over time, these walls have softened, their edges less sharp than they once were, but the overall form remains clearly visible. And that endurance reflects something important. Because structures like this are not built quickly. They require effort, repeated, sustained. And that suggests a community capable of organizing at that effort over time, which brings the focus to its purpose, because hilltop enclosures are often associated with defense. And Rathgall does have features that support that interpretation. The multiple ramparts create layers of protection, each ring acting as a barrier, making movement toward the center more controlled and more difficult. And that layered design increases security, because it forces anyone approaching to pass through multiple boundaries. But defense alone does not fully explain the structure, because the interior space is not empty. There are traces of activity, evidence of occupation, which suggests that this was not just a temporary refuge. It was used, possibly lived in, or at least occupied regularly. And that introduces another possibility, that Rathgall functioned as a central place, a gathering site, a location where people came together, whether for protection, for social activity, or for purposes that are not fully understood. And that idea is supported by its position. Because from the top of the hill, the surrounding land is clearly visible. Fields stretch outward. Movement across the landscape can be observed from a distance. And that visibility is valuable, not just for defense, but for awareness, for connection, for maintaining control over a wider area. And that suggests that the site may have held importance beyond its immediate boundaries, that it was part of a larger system, not isolated, but connected to the surrounding region. And then there is the question of time, because Rathgall shows signs of use across different periods, with its origins likely dating back to the Bronze Age. And over time, the structure appears to have been reused, adapted, maintained in different ways, which means its significance lasted. It was not built once and forgotten. It remained relevant, and that continuity reflects something deeper. Because for a place to be reused, it must retain meaning, whether practical, symbolic, or both. And that meaning is not always visible in the structure itself. It exists in how the space is used, and how it is understood by the people who interact with it. And that understanding changes over time, which means the function of Rathgall may have shifted from defense to gathering to something else entirely. And that creates a layered history, because what we see now is not a single moment. It is the result of many, built, used, reused, and eventually left. And over time, the structure settles into the landscape. The stones remain, the circles are still visible, but the activity fades, and what is left is the form, a pattern that still defines the hill, a structure that still suggests organization, even without the people who created it. And maybe that's what makes Rathgall stand out. because it shows how a place can hold meaning over long periods of time, not through a single purpose, but through change, adaptation, and continuity. And even now, standing on that hill, the pattern is still clear. Not natural, not random, but shaped, layer by layer, until the land itself became part of the design, and that design remains. Quiet, defined, and still, carrying the outline of something that once mattered. The megalithic mausolea of the steppe. In the vast open landscapes of central Kazakhstan, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the land feels almost untouched, there are structures that rise quietly from the ground in forms that don't immediately match what we expect from ancient burial sites. They are not hidden beneath mounds. They are not entirely buried. They stand. Constructed from stone, layered, deliberate. This is the Bagazi megalithic mausolea. And what makes them unusual is not just their presence in such an open environment, but the way they were built with a level of structure that suggests more than simple burial. Because these are not small graves or isolated markers. They are monumental tombs, constructed with large stone slabs arranged to create enclosed spaces that feel architectural rather than symbolic alone. The outer form is often polygonal or rectangular, defined by heavy stone walls that rise upward to create a contained structure. Inside, there is a chamber, sometimes surrounded by additional layers of stone that reinforce the outer boundary. And that layering matters, because it suggests intention beyond basic function. The structure is not just holding a burial. It is defining space, creating separation between interior and exterior. And that separation is controlled. The entrances are narrow, the walls are thick. Movement into the chamber is limited, which creates a sense of enclosure that feels deliberate, as if the structure is meant to hold something in place rather than simply mark its location. And that raises the first question. Why build at this scale? Because constructing something like this in an open steppe environment requires effort that goes beyond necessity. The stones must be gathered, transported across distances, positioned with accuracy. And that process is not simple. It requires coordination, planning, and a reason strong enough to justify the effort, which suggests importance. Because structures like this are not built for ordinary individuals. They are built for those who held status, power, or significance within their society. And that aligns with what is known about the Begazi Dandibai culture, which existed during the late Bronze Age in this region. A culture that developed complex burial practices, reflecting social hierarchy and structured systems of belief. And these mausolea are part of that system, not just as tombs, but as statements, visible markers of identity, of status that extends beyond life. And that visibility matters, because unlike burial sites that are concealed beneath the ground, these structures remain above it. They can be seen, recognized, remembered. And that suggests a connection between the living and the dead that is not hidden but present within the landscape. And then there is the design itself, because the stones are not placed randomly. They are arranged with attention to shape and balance. The walls align, the chambers hold their form, and the entire structure maintains stability despite exposure to weather over long periods of time. And that reflects knowledge, not just of material, but of how to use it, how to build something that lasts. And that is not accidental, it is learned, developed, and repeated. Because these mausolea are not isolated. They appear across the region, forming a pattern that suggests shared methods and shared understanding, which means this was not a single construction. It was part of a tradition, a way of building that was understood and applied over time. And that continuity is important, because it shows that the knowledge required to create these structures was maintained, passed on, adapted. And that implies communication, a system that extends beyond a single group or moment. And then there is the question of environment, because the steppe is not an easy place for construction. It is open, exposed, subject to wind and change, and yet these structures remain, standing against that environment, holding their form, which suggests that they were built not only with intention but with an understanding of how to endure within that landscape. And that endurance creates presence, because even now, long after the people who built them are gone, the mausolea still mark the land. They still define space. They still suggest that something important once existed there. And that presence is quiet, not overwhelming, but clear. Because the structures do not disappear, they remain. And that makes them different, because they are not just records of burial, they are records of how people chose to remember, how they chose to mark significance, and how they placed that meaning into the landscape itself. And maybe that's what makes the Bagazi Mausolea stand out, because they show that even in vast open environments where nothing seems permanent, people created structures that could endure not by hiding them, but by building them to stand. And even now across the steppe, they remain, structured, defined, and still holding the outline of a system that once gave them meaning, the stone trilithon by the sea. In the islands of Tonga, surrounded by the open Pacific Ocean, there is a structure that stands in a landscape where most ancient remains are not made from massive stone. The ground is flat, the air is still, and in the middle of it, 3 stones stand, not scattered, not broken, but placed with precision. This is Ha'amonga Amaui, and at first it appears simple: 2 vertical stones, 1 horizontal stone resting across the top, a trilithon. But the simplicity is what makes it unusual, because each of these stones is enormous, weighing several tons, carved from coral limestone, shaped and positioned in a way that creates a balanced structure that has remained standing for centuries, and that immediately raises a question. How were they moved? Because transporting stones of this size across an island environment requires coordination, effort, and a method that is not immediately obvious. The stones had to be cut, shaped, moved across distance, and then lifted into position, all without the kind of machinery we would expect today. Which means the construction was not accidental. It required knowledge, planning, and a system capable of organizing that effort. And that suggests importance, because structures like this are not built without reason. They serve a purpose, even if that purpose is not fully clear today. Some interpretations suggest that Ha'amonga a Maui functioned as a kind of gateway, a ceremonial entrance, a place that marks transition from one space to another. And that idea fits the form, because the space beneath the horizontal stone creates a passage, a defined opening, one that can be moved through, and that movement can carry meaning, because passing through a structure like this is not the same as walking across open ground. It creates a moment, a shift, from one side to the other, and that kind of transition is often associated with ritual, with events that are not part of everyday activity, but part of something more structured. And then there is another possibility, because some researchers suggest that the trilithon may have been aligned with the movement of the sun, that certain positions of the sunrise or sunset could be observed through the opening at specific times of the year. And if that is the case, then the structure becomes more than symbolic. It becomes functional, a way of marking time, a way of connecting the landscape to the sky. And that idea appears in many ancient structures across different regions, where alignment and observation are built into the design. Not always obvious, but present. And that raises another layer, because now the structure is not only about placement, it is about orientation, how it is positioned in relation to the world around it. And that requires understanding, not just of material, but of movement, of cycles, of patterns that repeat over time. And that suggests a level of awareness that goes beyond simple construction. And then there is the cultural context, because Ha'amonga a Maui is often associated with the Tongan chief Tuitatui, who is believed to have ordered its construction. And in local tradition, the structure is linked to the demigod Maui, a figure known across Polynesian mythology. And that connection adds meaning, because now the structure exists not only as a physical object, but as part of a story, part of a cultural identity. And that identity shapes how it is understood, not just as a construction, but as something connected to belief, to memory, to narrative. And that is important, because many ancient structures exist at the intersection of function and meaning. They serve practical purposes, but they also represent something. And that representation can be just as significant as the structure itself. And then there is the passage of time, because despite exposure to weather, to environmental change, to the passing of centuries, the trilithon still stands. The stones remain balanced. The structure holds its form. And that endurance reflects something important. Because whatever method was used to build it, it was effective. Not temporary, but lasting. And that creates presence. Because the structure does not fade into the ground. It remains visible, recognizable, a fixed point in the landscape. And maybe that is what makes Ha'amonga, a Maui, stand out. Because it shows how something very simple in form can carry complexity in meaning. 3 stones, placed, balanced. And yet, within that simplicity, there is effort, planning, possibly alignment, possibly symbolism. And even now, standing before it, the structure still creates that moment. That sense of passing through something defined, of moving between spaces. And that experience remains, even if the full purpose behind it is no longer completely clear. Because the structure continues to do what it was designed to do, to stand, to define, and to mark a place within the landscape that was shaped with intention. The fortified water structure in the plain. In the dry plains of central Spain, where the land stretches wide under an open sky and the climate shifts between extremes, there is a structure that at first does not reveal what it truly is. From a distance, it appears as a low rise, circular, compact, almost like a mound shaped by time. But as you move closer, the structure becomes clearer. Stone walls, layered, enclosing something within. This is Motilla de Lazuer. And what makes it unusual is not just its form, but the way it was built around a single critical element: water. Dating back to the Bronze Age around 2200 BCE, this site belongs to a period when environmental conditions in the region were becoming more difficult. Extended droughts, changing rainfall patterns, and limited access to reliable water sources created a situation where survival depended on control. And that is exactly what this structure represents. Because at the center of Motilla de Lazuer is a deep well, one of the oldest known in the Iberian Peninsula, reaching down to access groundwater beneath the surface. And everything around it is built to protect that access. The structure is formed by concentric walls, built in layers that move inward toward the center. Each wall creates a boundary, narrowing the space and guiding movement toward the well itself. And that layout is not random, it is controlled. Because access to water was not open, it was regulated. And that changes how the site is understood, because this is not just a settlement. It is a system built around a resource, a place designed to secure, manage, and protect something essential. And that purpose explains the construction. The walls are thick. The entrances are limited. Movement is directed through narrow pathways that can be monitored and controlled. And that suggests awareness, not just of scarcity, but of the need to manage it carefully. Because when a resource is limited, access becomes important, and controlling that access becomes necessary. And that is exactly what we see here. The outer areas of the structure include open spaces that may have been used for daily activity, while the inner sections become more restricted as they approach the well. And that creates a gradient, from open to controlled, from accessible to limited, and that design reflects structure, not just in architecture, but in how the space was used. And then there's the broader settlement, because Motilla de Lazuer was not isolated. It was part of a network of similar sites across the region, each built with comparable designs, each centered around water access. And that repetition suggests a shared response, a system developed to deal with the same environmental challenge. And that means this was not a single solution. It was a pattern, a method that was understood and applied in multiple locations. And that requires communication, shared knowledge, and a understanding of how to adapt to conditions that affected entire regions. And then there is the construction itself. Because building with stone in this way requires effort, the materials must be gathered, transported, placed with care, and arranged in a way that creates stability over time. And that stability is still visible. Because even after thousands of years, the structure remains. The walls still define the space. The central well is still present. And the layout is still clear. And that clarity allows us to see something important. Not just what was built, but why it was built. Because this structure is not symbolic in the same way as many other ancient sites. It is practical, direct, focused on a single need. And that makes it different. Because instead of representing belief or memory, it represents adaptation, a response to environment, a way of surviving in conditions that required planning and control. And that does not make it less complex. If anything, it makes it more precise, because every part of the structure is connected to its purpose. The walls, the layout, the position of the well, all of it works together. And that integration is what allows it to function. And then, like many ancient systems, it reaches a point where it is no longer used. Conditions change, the need shifts, or the population moves, and the structure is left behind. But unlike systems that disappear completely, this one remains visible, because stone endures, the walls hold, the form stays intact, and the purpose, even if no longer active, is still understandable. And maybe that's what makes Motia del Azur stand out. Because it shows how necessity can shape construction, how environment can define architecture, and how a single resource can influence the design of an entire structure. And even now, standing within those walls, the pattern is still clear. Not random, not decorative, but functional. Built layer by layer to protect something essential. And that intention remains, quiet, defined, and still visible in the structure that surrounds it. The hidden city above the valley, high in the Andes of Peru, where the mountains rise sharply and clouds move slowly across deep valleys, there is a place that remains far less visited than others of its kind. It is not easy to reach. The path is long, steep, and often isolated, cutting through terrain that feels distant from everything else. And because of that distance, the site itself feels separated from the world around it, as if it exists in its own space. This is Choquequirao. And what makes it unusual is not just its location, but the way it reveals itself slowly, almost as if it was not meant to be found all at once. At first, the structures appear in fragments, stone terraces, walls, sections of buildings emerging from the mountain. But as you move further, the scale becomes clear. This is not a small settlement. It is a city, spread across the slopes, organized in a way that adapts to the terrain while still maintaining structure and balance. The terraces cut across the mountain in long horizontal lines, creating flat surfaces where none naturally exist, holding the soil in place and shaping the land itself. And that shaping is precise, because each terrace is supported by carefully constructed stone walls, fitted together without mortar, designed to remain stable despite the shifting conditions of the mountain environment. And that requires understanding, not just of construction, but of landscape, of how the ground moves, how water flows, and how to build in a way that works with those forces rather than against them. And then there is the layout of the city itself, because Choquequirao is not random. The structures are arranged with intention. Residential areas, ceremonial spaces, pathways that connect different sections, all positioned in relation to the slope, the sunlight, and the surrounding environment. And that suggests planning at a large scale, because building across a mountain is not simple. It requires coordination, effort repeated over time, and a system that supports that effort. And that system is often associated with the Inca civilization, known for its ability to construct in difficult terrain, integrating architecture directly into the natural environment. And that integration is visible here, because the city does not sit on the mountain, it becomes part of it. The terraces follow the contours, the walls align with the slope. The entire structure feels connected to the land rather than placed on top of it. And that creates a different kind of presence, because instead of standing apart, the city blends with its surroundings, even as it reshapes them. And then there are the details, because within the terraces there are patterns. Stone arrangements that form shapes, sometimes interpreted as symbolic or representational, embedded into the structure itself. And that suggests something beyond function, because now the terraces are not only supporting agriculture, they are also carrying meaning. And that combination appears in many ancient sites, where practical design and symbolic expression exist together. And then there is the question of purpose, because Choqquequirao is often compared to Machu Picchu, but it is less studied, less understood, and less defined in terms of its exact role. Some suggest it functioned as a regional center. Others see it as a ceremonial site, a place of significance within a larger network. And that uncertainty remains. Because while the structures are visible, the full story is not. And that creates a space for interpretation, because the city is not fully revealed. Large portions remain covered, unexcavated, hidden beneath layers of vegetation and earth, which means what we see is only part of what exists, and that makes the site feel incomplete, not in its construction, but in our understanding of it. And then there is the experience of being there, because the isolation changes everything. The distance from other sites, the effort required to reach it, all contribute to a sense that this place was not meant for constant access. It was positioned deliberately, placed in a location that creates separation. And that separation can carry meaning, because it defines who arrives, who enters, and how the space is experienced. And that suggests control, not through walls alone, but through distance. And that is a different kind of boundary. And then, like many ancient sites, there is a point where the activity ends. The city is no longer maintained, the structures remain, but the people are gone. And over time, the environment begins to reclaim the space. Vegetation grows, paths disappear, sections become hidden again, until the site returns to a state that feels almost untouched. And yet, the structure is still there, the terraces still hold the mountain, the walls still define space, the layout is still visible, and that creates a quiet continuity. Because even without activity, the system remains. And maybe that's what makes Choqquequirao stand out. Because it is not fully revealed, not fully understood, and not fully explored. It exists somewhere between presence and absence. Visible, but not complete. And that leaves something open. Because what we see is enough to understand that something significant was built here, but not enough to fully explain why. And that uncertainty becomes part of its identity. A city that still holds parts of its story beneath the surface, and continues to suggest that there is more still waiting to be uncovered. The Tower Before Cities. In the region of the Jordan Valley, near one of the oldest continuously inhabited areas in the world, there is a structure that predates what we usually think of as civilization itself. It stands not as part of a large visible city, but as a remnant of something far older, buried beneath layers of time and settlement that have built up over thousands of years. This is the Jericho Tower. And what makes it unusual is not just its age, but the moment in history it represents. Dating back to around 8000 BCE, this tower was constructed long before organized cities, long before metal tools, and long before the systems we associate with large-scale building. And yet, it exists. A massive stone structure, circular in form, rising upward with a level of intention that suggests planning rather than simple stacking of material. Because this is not a natural formation. It was built. And building something like this at that time changes how we understand early human societies. The tower is made from stone, carefully arranged to create a solid structure that rises several meters above the ground. Inside, there is a staircase built into the interior, leading upward in a controlled path that suggests the structure was meant to be accessed, not simply observed. And that detail matters, because it shows that the tower was not just symbolic, it was functional, designed for movement, for use. And that raises the first question: why build it? Because constructing something of this scale requires coordination, people working together, time invested over a period long enough to complete it. And that implies organization, a group capable of planning and carrying out a project that goes beyond immediate survival. And that is significant, because it suggests that even at this early stage there were systems in place that allowed for collective effort directed toward a shared goal. And that goal may not have been purely practical. Some interpretations suggest that the tower was part of a defensive system, possibly connected to walls that surrounded the early settlement of Jericho. And that is possible, because elevation provides visibility. It allows observation of the surrounding area. It creates a point from which movement can be seen. But there are other interpretations as well, because the structure does not fit perfectly into the idea of defense alone. The staircase is internal. The design is controlled. And the effort required suggests something more than a simple watchtower. Some researchers have suggested that the tower may have had a symbolic or ritual function, possibly connected to the surrounding landscape. The orientation of the staircase and the positioning of the tower have been linked to the movement of the sun and nearby mountains, suggesting that it may have been used to mark time or observe seasonal changes. And if that is the case, then the tower becomes more than a structure. It becomes a way of understanding the world, a way of connecting the built environment to natural cycles. And that idea appears in many later cultures. But here, it appears much earlier, which makes it stand out. Because it suggests that the impulse to build with meaning, not just function, existed long before more complex societies emerged. And then there is the context of Jericho itself. Because this was not an isolated structure. It was part of one of the earliest known settlements, a place where people began to shift from nomadic life to more permanent habitation. And that transition changes everything. Because once people begin to stay in one place, the way they build begins to change. Structures become more stable, more defined, more permanent. And the tower reflects that shift. It is not temporary. It is not easily dismantled. It is built to last. And that intention is still visible. Because even after thousands of years, the structure remains partially preserved, but clearly defined. And that preservation allows us to see something important. Not just the tower itself, but the moment it represents. A point in time where human societies began to organize in new ways, to build not just for immediate need, but for something larger, something that required planning, coordination, and a shared understanding of purpose. And maybe that's what makes the Jericho Tower stand out, because it does not belong to a fully developed city. It comes before that. It exists at the beginning, at a moment where the idea of building something large and lasting was just starting to take form. And even now, as the layers of history continue to surround it, the tower remains, not complete, but enough to show that something significant was built here, something that marked a shift from temporary to permanent, from individual effort to collective action, and from simple shelter to structures that begin to carry meaning, the chamber aligned with the winter sun. On the Orkney Islands, where the land is low, winds move constantly across the fields, and the sky often feels closer than it should. There is a structure that does not immediately reveal what it contains. From the outside, it appears as a grassy mound, rounded, still, almost indistinguishable from the natural rises in the surrounding terrain. But beneath that surface, there is precision. This is Meisho, And what makes it unusual is not just its age, but the way it was built with a level of alignment that suggests careful observation of the world beyond the ground itself. Dating back to around 2800 BCE, this chambered cairn belongs to a period when people began constructing spaces not just for burial, but for something more structured, something that connects the physical and the cyclical. The entrance is low and narrow, positioned in a way that forces a controlled movement into the structure. As you pass through, the passage extends inward, built from large stone slabs that form both the walls and the ceiling, creating a corridor that feels enclosed and deliberate. The further you move inside, the more the outside world begins to disappear. The light fades, sound softens, and the space narrows until it reaches the central chamber. And this chamber is not random in its design. It is square, balanced, constructed with large stones fitted together with precision, forming a space that holds its shape without the need for binding materials. And that precision matters, because this is not simply a hollow space beneath a mound. It is a defined interior, a place that was shaped intentionally. And that intention becomes even clearer when considering its alignment. Because during the winter solstice, as the sun sets on the horizon, light enters the passage and travels inward, reaching the central chamber and illuminating its interior. And that moment is not accidental. It happens once each year, at a specific time, under specific conditions, which means the structure was oriented with knowledge of that cycle. And that knowledge requires observation, not over a short period, but over years, tracking the movement of the sun, understanding its patterns, and then translating that understanding into construction. And that changes how the structure is understood, because now it is not only a burial site, it is a marker, a way of connecting the ground to the sky, a way of embedding time into stone. And that suggests a deeper layer of meaning, because the alignment creates an event, a moment when light enters a space that is otherwise dark. And that moment would have been predictable, expected, recognized. And that recognition could carry significance beyond function. Symbolic, ritual, connected to cycles of life, death, and renewal. And then there is the construction itself, because building something like this requires effort. The stones are large, heavy, transported and positioned with care. The passage is straight, the chamber is stable, and the entire structure is covered by a mound that protects it from above. And that protection has worked, because even after thousands of years, the interior remains intact. The alignment still functions. The structure still holds. And that endurance reflects something important, because whatever method was used to build it, it was effective. Not temporary, but lasting. And then there is the later history. Because long after its original use, the site was entered again. Vikings left markings on the walls, carvings that remain visible today, adding another layer to the structure's history. And that changes its identity. Because now it is not only a Neolithic structure, it is a place that has been interacted with across different periods. Reused, reinterpreted, and that continuity adds depth, because it shows that the structure did not disappear from awareness. It remained, recognized, even if its original meaning changed. And maybe that's what makes my show stand out, because it combines multiple layers of understanding, construction, alignment, time, and memory, all contained within a single structure. And even now, standing outside, looking at what appears to be nothing more than a mound, it is difficult to fully grasp what lies beneath. But inside, the structure remains, defined, precise, and still aligned with a moment that repeats every year, a moment where light enters darkness, exactly as it was designed to do. The stone complex on the ridge. In northern Sardinia, where the land rises into rocky ridges overlooking wide stretches of open terrain, there is a site that does not immediately fit into a single category. It is not clearly a settlement, it is not entirely a fort, and it does not resemble a single-purpose structure. Instead, it appears as a combination. Stone walls, open spaces, elevated ground shaped with intention. This is Monte Baranta, and what makes it unusual is not just the structures themselves, but the way they are arranged across the ridge, forming a complex that feels both controlled and open at the same time. Dating back to the Copper Age, around 2500 BCE, the site belongs to a period where construction begins to take on more defined forms, but still does not fully resemble the systems seen in later civilizations. The most visible feature is a large stone wall built along the edge of the ridge, creating a boundary that separates one side of the landscape from the other. And this wall is not small. It is massive, constructed from large stones placed together to form a barrier that follows the natural line of the terrain. And that immediately suggests purpose. Because building something like this requires effort. The stones must be gathered, transported, positioned with care, and arranged in a way that creates stability. And that level of effort is not applied without reason. One interpretation is that the wall served a defensive purpose. Its position along the ridge would allow control over movement, creating a natural advantage combined with constructed boundaries. And that fits with the idea of protection. But there is something unusual about the design. Because the wall does not fully enclose the site, it creates a division, but not complete isolation. And that raises questions. Because if defense was the only purpose, a more enclosed structure might be expected. Which suggests that the function may have been more complex, possibly controlling access rather than completely preventing it, defining space rather than sealing it. And that idea becomes clear when looking at the rest of the site, because beyond the wall there are open areas that show signs of use. Flat spaces, arranged in a way that suggests activity. Not random movement, but structured use of the landscape. And then there is another feature, a raised platform, constructed from stone, positioned in a way that stands out from the surrounding terrain. And this platform changes the interpretation, because elevated structures often carry significance. They draw attention, they create focus, and they suggest that something important took place there. Not necessarily for daily life, but for events, gatherings, or activities that required a defined space. And that introduces another possibility, that Monte Baranta was not only a defensive or residential site, but also a place of gathering, a location, where people came together for purposes that are not fully understood. And that combination makes it difficult to classify, because it does not fit into a single category. It exists between functions, between defense, between habitation, between ritual. And that ambiguity is part of what makes it interesting, because it suggests that the people who built it were not limited to a single use of space. They created something flexible, something that could serve multiple roles. And that requires planning, because combining functions within a single site requires understanding of how those functions interact, where movement happens, where boundaries are placed, how space is divided and connected at the same time. And that level of organization is visible here, even if the exact purpose is not fully clear. And then there is the location itself, because building on a ridge is not accidental. It provides visibility, control over the surrounding land, and a natural advantage that can be combined with constructed features. And that combination appears here: the natural elevation, the added stone wall, the structured spaces, all working together. And that integration is important, because it shows that the site was not placed randomly. It was chosen, selected for its position, and then shaped. And that shaping leaves a mark, because even now the structure remains visible, the wall still defines the edge, the platform still stands, the layout is still clear. And that clarity allows us to see something beyond the surface, not just what was built, but how it was thought through. And maybe that's what makes Monte Baranta stand out, because it does not present a single, clear answer. It presents a combination, a structure that reflects multiple possibilities, and invites interpretation, not as a mystery without evidence, but as a system that we can see, even if we do not fully understand how it was used. And even now, standing on that ridge, looking out across the land, the structure still defines the space. Quiet, open, but clearly shaped, and still holding the outline of something that was built with intention, even if that intention is no longer completely clear. The mound of early power. In eastern Turkey, where the land stretches between mountains and open plains, there is a site that does not appear as a single structure rising above the ground, but as a mound formed over time, layer by layer, generation by generation. This is Arslantepe. And what makes it unusual is not just what was built here, but how long it was built for, because this is not a single moment in history. It is many. The mound itself is the result of repeated construction, where new buildings were placed on top of older ones, gradually raising the ground higher and higher. What we see today is the accumulation of those layers, compressed into a single form that holds thousands of years of activity within it. And that changes how the site is understood, because instead of looking at one structure, we are looking at a sequence, a record of change, a system that evolved over time. And within that system, something begins to appear. Organization, not how buildings are placed, but in how power is structured. Because during the late Chalcolithic period, around 3000 BCE, Arslantepe shows evidence of something that feels different from earlier settlements. Large buildings, administrative spaces, areas that suggest control and coordination beyond simple daily life. And that introduces a new idea. Because now the site is not only about living, it is about management, about systems that organize people, resources, and activity. And that is significant, because it marks a transition from small, loosely structured communities to something more defined, something that begins to resemble early forms of governance. And that becomes clearer when looking at the architecture, because some of the buildings are not designed for habitation. They are larger, more structured, divided into rooms that suggest storage, administration, and controlled access. And that implies function, not personal, but collective, spaces that serve a group rather than an individual. And that requires coordination, planning, and a system that supports that level of organization. And then there are the findings, because within the site, objects have been discovered that point to something else. Metal weapons, early forms of swords, among the oldest known examples. And that detail matters, because it suggests not only technological development, but also conflict, or at least the possibility of it. And that adds another layer, because now the site is not only administrative, but also connected to control, to power. And that power is reflected in the layout, in how space is divided, in how access is managed, and in how resources are stored and distributed. And that creates a system, one that goes beyond simple survival, and begins to resemble something more complex, something structured, something organized at a level that requires leadership. And that is what makes Arslantepe stand out, because it captures a moment where human society begins to shift, not suddenly, but gradually, from small-scale living to systems that require coordination across larger groups. And that shift is not always visible in a single structure, but here it is preserved in layers, each level representing a stage in that process. And that layering is important, because it allows us to see change over time, not as an abstract idea, but as something built into the ground itself. And then, as with many ancient sites, there is a point where the system changes. New structures replace old ones. Functions shift, and eventually the site is no longer used in the same way. But the mound remains, holding all of those layers within it. And that creates a different kind of presence, because what we see is not a single moment, but the accumulation of many, compressed into one form. And that form still carries meaning, because even without fully uncovering every layer, the pattern is visible: growth, change, organization, and the emergence of systems that begin to define how societies function. And maybe that's what makes Arslan Tepe stand out, because it shows that complexity does not appear fully formed. It develops, layer by layer, decision by decision, until something new begins to take shape, and that shape is still visible here, not in a single structure, but in the mound itself, a record of how people began to organize not just their space, but their society. The burial chamber beneath the capstone. In the countryside of South Wales, where the land rolls gently between fields and low hills, there is a structure that at first appears almost impossibly simple, and yet at the same time unusually deliberate in the way it occupies space. It stands in an open field, exposed to the sky, without walls to enclose it or earth to fully conceal it. And because of that openness, the entire form is visible at once, revealing a construction that relies not on complexity of parts, but on the careful balance of a few massive elements placed with precision. This is Tinkin's Wood burial chamber. What immediately draws attention is the capstone, a single enormous slab of stone that rests across supporting uprights, forming a chamber beneath it. And while the structure itself is not large in the sense of scale seen in later monuments, the weight and presence of that stone changes the way it is perceived, because this is not a natural arrangement. The capstone weighs several tons, far more than what could be moved without coordination, and its placement requires not only the ability to transport it across distance, but also the ability to lift and position it with control, ensuring that it rests securely on the stones beneath it without shifting. And that raises the first question, one that appears in many megalithic structures but feels especially direct here, because the simplicity of the form leaves little to distract from it. How was this done? Not in a general sense, but in a practical one, involving real movement, real effort, and real planning carried out by people who did not have access to modern tools, yet were still able to achieve a result that has endured for thousands of years. The chamber beneath the capstone is enclosed by upright stones that create a defined interior space, and while this space is not large, it is clearly shaped with intention, forming a place that is separate from the surrounding environment, both physically and symbolically, because stepping into that space even now creates a transition from open landscape into enclosure, from light into shadow, from movement into stillness. And that transition is not accidental, it is built into the structure itself. Archaeological evidence indicates that Tinkin's Wood dates back to the Neolithic period, around 4000 BCE, placing it among some of the earliest constructed burial sites in the region. And excavations have revealed human remains within the chamber, along with objects that suggest ritual activity rather than simple interment. Which means this was not only a place where the dead were placed, it was a place where something was done, repeated, structured, possibly ceremonial. And that distinction matters, because it shifts the structure from being a passive container to being an active space, one that was used in ways that involved people returning to it, interacting with it, and maintaining its significance over time. Originally, the chamber would have been covered by a mound of earth, enclosing the structure and concealing it from the outside, leaving only a defined entrance that led inward, and that changes how it would have been experienced. Because instead of standing in the open as it does now, it would have existed as something partially hidden, requiring entry rather than simply observation. And that entry is controlled. The passage into the chamber is not wide or open, but narrow and defined, guiding movement in a specific direction, creating a sense of progression from outside to inside that feels deliberate rather than incidental. And that idea of movement is important, because in structures like this, the act of entering is not separate from the purpose of the structure. It is part of it. The alignment of the chamber also suggests awareness of the surrounding environment, with indications that the entrance may have been positioned in relation to the rising sun, allowing light to enter at specific times, connecting the interior space to external cycles in a way that is not immediately visible but becomes clear through observation. And that connection adds another layer, because now the structure is not only about space, it is about time. It links a fixed place on the ground to patterns that repeat in the sky, creating a relationship between what is built and what is observed. And that relationship appears across many ancient sites, suggesting that this was not an isolated idea, but part of a broader way of understanding the world. The construction itself reflects knowledge of balance and weight, with the capstone positioned in such a way that it distributes its mass across the supporting stones, creating stability without the need for binding materials. And that stability has allowed the structure to remain intact despite exposure to weather, erosion, and the passage of thousands of years. And that endurance is significant because it shows that whatever methods were used, they were not temporary solutions, but effective techniques that allowed the structure to persist far beyond the time of its builders. Over time, the mound that once covered the chamber was removed or eroded, leaving the stone structure exposed, and that exposure changes how it is perceived, transforming it from something hidden and enclosed into something visible and open. But even in that changed state, the core of the structure remains the same. The chamber still holds its form. The capstone still rests above it. The space still creates that transition from outside to inside. And that continuity allows us to understand something about its original purpose, even if not every detail is fully known. Because the structure still functions in the way it was designed. It still defines space. It still guides movement. It still creates a boundary between different conditions. And maybe that is what makes Tinkenswood stand out. Not because it is the largest or most complex structure, but because its simplicity makes its intention more visible. There are no additional layers to distract from it. No elaborate features to reinterpret. Just stone, placed, balanced. And through that simplicity, something is made clear. That this was not a random arrangement, but a deliberate construction, built with purpose, used over time, and maintained long enough to leave a lasting mark. And even now, standing in that open field, with the sky above and the land stretching outward in every direction, the structure continues to hold that presence. Not imposing, not overwhelming, but defined, stable, and still carrying the shape of something that was built thousands of years ago, with an understanding that even now is only partially understood. The megalithic cairn overlooking the sea. On the northern coast of Brittany, where the land meets the Atlantic and the horizon stretches outward without interruption, there is a structure that at first appears as a long, low mound of stone resting quietly above the shoreline, blending into the landscape in a way that makes it seem almost natural, as if it has always been part of the ground. But as you approach, the scale becomes clear, and the shape begins to reveal something that cannot be explained by erosion or time alone. This is Cairn of Barnetnes. And what makes it unusual is not only its size, but the way it was constructed with a level of organization that suggests long-term planning carried out over generations, rather than a single moment of effort. Dating back to around 4500 BCE, this structure is one of the oldest known megalithic monuments in Europe. Built thousands of years before many of the more widely recognized ancient sites, and yet it already shows a level of complexity that feels deliberate and refined. The cairn itself is made up of layers of stone piled and arranged to form an elongated mound that stretches across the ridge. And within that mound are multiple passage graves, each with its own entrance, corridor, and internal chamber, all contained within the same overall structure. And that internal complexity changes how the structure is understood. Because what appears from the outside as a single form is actually a collection of spaces, each built with care, each serving a purpose that is both individual and connected to the whole. The entrances are positioned along one side of the cairn, facing generally toward the same direction, suggesting that orientation was considered during construction, possibly aligning with the movement of the sun or the surrounding landscape in a way that connects the structure to external cycles. Each passage leads inward through a narrow corridor formed by upright stones and covered by large slabs that create a stable ceiling, guiding movement into a central chamber where the space opens slightly, creating a defined interior that feels separate from the outside world. And that transition from outside to inside is not accidental, because it creates a shift in experience, moving from open light into enclosed darkness, from exposure into containment. And that shift appears repeatedly across the different chambers within the cairn. The chambers themselves vary in shape, some circular, some more elongated, but all constructed using large stone slabs arranged to create stable walls and roofs, often corbelled inward to form a dome-like structure that distributes weight effectively without the use of binding materials. And that method of construction reflects understanding not only of how to move and place stone, but of how to create stability through form, allowing the structure to endure over long periods despite environmental exposure. Inside some of the chambers, carvings can be found on the stones, simple in appearance, but deliberate in placement, suggesting that the interior spaces were not only functional but also carried symbolic meaning, marking them as places of significance rather than simple enclosures. Archaeological evidence indicates that these chambers were used for burial, with human remains placed within them over time. But the structure itself suggests that the purpose extended beyond a single event, because the number of chambers and the effort required to construct them implies repeated use and continued importance, which raises the idea that this was not just a tomb, but a place that was returned to, revisited, and maintained as part of a broader system of belief or memory. And that system required coordination, because constructing a cairn of this size with multiple internal chambers is not a short process. It involves gathering materials, organizing labor, and maintaining a consistent design over time, which suggests a level of social structure capable of supporting such an effort. And that structure is visible in the way the cairn is organized, not only in its internal layout, but in its overall form, which maintains a clear shape despite the complexity within, creating a unified exterior that conceals the intricacy of the spaces inside. Over time, the cairn appears to have been expanded, with additional chambers added and sections extended, indicating that the structure evolved rather than remaining fixed, adapting to changing needs or continued use across generations. And that evolution is important, because it shows that the site was not static, but active, responding to the people who used it and the purposes it served. Eventually, like many ancient sites, its original use came to an end, the chambers were no longer accessed in the same way, and the structure remained as a physical form while its function shifted or disappeared entirely. But the cairn itself endured, its massive stone holding together across centuries, resisting erosion and maintaining its shape even as the surrounding landscape changed. And that endurance allows us to see something clearly. Not only the structure itself, but the intention behind it, the effort that was invested in creating something that could last beyond the immediate needs of its builders. Standing near the cairn today, overlooking the sea, the relationship between the structure and its environment becomes more apparent. Because the placement is not random, it is positioned in a way that connects land and horizon, creating a setting that feels chosen rather than incidental. And that choice adds meaning, because it suggests that the location was as important as the construction, linking the structure to the wider landscape in a way that reinforces its significance. And maybe that is what makes the Cairn of Barnenay stand out. Not only its age or its scale, but the combination of simplicity in form and complexity in design, the way it conceals multiple spaces within a single structure, and the way it reflects a level of organization that existed far earlier than we often expect. Because this is not just a mound of stones, but a system, built layer by layer, chamber by chamber, over time, with intention that is still visible even if the full meaning is no longer completely understood. And even now, as the sea continues to move beyond it and the land remains quiet around it, the cairn holds its place, stable, defined, and still carrying the shape of something that was built thousands of years ago to endure. The defensive city on the hill. In the southeastern region of Spain, where dry hills rise above wide valleys, and the landscape carries the marks of long periods of settlement, there is a site that does not immediately appear extraordinary from a distance, yet becomes increasingly complex the closer it is observed. This is La Bastida. At first it looks like a hill, then slowly the structure begins to appear. Stone walls, terraces, lines that do not belong to nature. And then it becomes clear. This was not just a settlement. It was built to defend, dating back to around 2200 BCE. During the Bronze Age, La Bastida belongs to a culture known as El Argar, a society that developed in this region with a level of organization that is still being studied today. And here, that organization is visible, because the settlement is not random, it is structured. Positioned on elevated ground, the site uses the natural slope as part of its design, creating an advantage that is reinforced by constructed defenses. Walls follow the contours of the hill, forming a boundary that controls movement and defines the limits of the settlement. And those walls are not simple. They are thick, reinforced, built from stone with a level of care that suggests they were meant to withstand pressure. Because this is not just about marking space, this is about protection. And protection requires planning. The entrances are narrow, access is controlled. Movement into the settlement is directed through specific points that could be monitored, which means entry was never open, it was managed. And that changes how the site is understood. Because now it is not only a place where people lived, it is a place where people controlled who could enter. And that implies awareness of threat, of conflict, and possibly of something worth protecting. Inside the walls, the layout continues to reflect that structure. Houses are built close together, arranged in a way that maximizes space while maintaining order, creating a dense environment where movement is guided rather than free. And that density matters, because it suggests efficiency. Space is limited, so it is used carefully. Rooms are defined, paths are narrow, everything feels positioned with intention, and that creates a different kind of settlement. Not open, not scattered, but compact, controlled. And then there are the materials. Stone is used consistently, not decorative, functional, placed in a way that creates strength, stability, endurance, and that reflects knowledge, not just of how to build, but how to build for purpose, because every part of this structure connects to its role. The elevation, the walls, the layout, all of it works together, and that suggests a system, not just construction, organization. And that organization extends beyond architecture, because La Bastida shows evidence of social hierarchy, different spaces, different uses. Not all areas are equal. Some are more protected, more central, and that reflects structure within the society itself, which means this is not just a defensive site. It is a controlled environment, a place where roles exist, where space reflects status. And that adds complexity, because now the site is not only about survival, it is about order. And then there is the broader context, because La Bastida is often described as one of the earliest examples of advanced fortification in Western Europe, showing features that appear more developed than what is typically expected for its time. And that creates a contrast, because the level of planning here feels ahead, more structured, more deliberate. And that raises a question. How did this level of organization develop? Because it does not appear suddenly, it builds, through experience, through necessity, and possibly through pressure. Because environments that require defense often accelerate development. They force systems to evolve. And that evolution becomes visible here, in the walls, in the layout, in the way the entire settlement functions as a single unit. And then, like many ancient sites, there is a shift. The system changes. The settlement is eventually abandoned. The reasons are not fully clear. Environmental factors, conflict, internal change, all possible, but what remains is the structure. The walls still trace the hill, the layout is still visible, and the intention is still clear. Because even without the people, the design remains. And that design continues to communicate something. Not random, not accidental, but controlled. Built with purpose. And maybe that's what makes La Bastida stand out. Because it shows a moment where settlements become more than places to live. They become systems. Defined. Organized. Built not just to exist, but to function under pressure. And even now, standing on that hill, looking across the surrounding land, the structure still holds that presence. Not as it once was, but enough to show that something complex existed here. Something planned. Something controlled. And something that reflects a level of understanding that continues to raise questions. The great houses in the desert. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, where the land stretches wide beneath an open sky, and the silence is broken only by wind moving across stone and sand, there is a place where the ground itself holds the outline of something far more structured than the environment would suggest. This is Chaco Canyon. And within this landscape, there are structures that do not appear as isolated buildings, but as part of a system that was built with a level of coordination that continues to raise questions. These are known as the Great Houses. At first, they appear as clusters of stone walls rising from the desert floor, their surfaces weathered by time, their edges softened by centuries of exposure, and yet their overall form remains clear enough to reveal that they were not constructed randomly, but according to a plan. The buildings are large, often multi-storied, constructed from sandstone blocks carefully shaped and fitted together, creating walls that remain stable despite the harsh conditions of the desert environment, and that stability reflects a level of understanding that goes beyond basic construction. Because these structures were not temporary, they were built to last. The layout of the great houses shows a level of organization that suggests central planning, with rooms arranged in defined sections, often forming D-shaped complexes that open onto large plazas, creating spaces that could accommodate both activity and gathering. And that arrangement is not incidental. It reflects intention. Because building at this scale requires coordination, not only in the placement of materials, but in the design itself, ensuring that each section connects to the next in a way that maintains both structure and function. And that raises the question of purpose, because the size of these buildings goes beyond what would be expected for simple habitation, suggesting that they served roles that were not limited to everyday living, possibly functioning as administrative centers, ceremonial spaces, or hubs within a larger network. And that network is one of the most significant aspects of Chaco Canyon, because the great houses are not isolated. They are connected. Roads extend outward from the canyon, straight and deliberate, cutting across the landscape in ways that do not always follow the natural terrain, suggesting that their construction was guided by principles that were not solely based on convenience. And those roads link Chaco to other sites across the region, creating a system that extends far beyond the canyon itself, indicating that this was not a single settlement, but a central point within a wider structure. And that structure required organization, because maintaining connections across distance, constructing buildings of this scale, and coordinating activity within them implies a level of social complexity that challenges earlier assumptions about the societies that lived here. And then there is the alignment, because some of the great houses appear to be positioned in relation to celestial events, with certain features aligned to the movement of the sun or moon, suggesting that observation of the sky may have been integrated into the design of the structures. And that adds another layer, because now the buildings are not only functional, they are observational. They connect the ground to the sky. And that connection reflects a way of understanding the environment that includes both physical and cyclical elements. And then there is the question of materials, because sandstone is not always immediately available in the exact form needed for construction, meaning that stone had to be gathered, shaped, and transported, sometimes over distance, requiring effort that was repeated many times to create the structures that remain today. And that repetition reflects a system, not a single project, but ongoing construction, maintenance, expansion. That continuity suggests that Chaco Canyon remained significant for a long period of time, functioning as a center where activity was sustained and developed rather than temporary or short-lived. But eventually, like many ancient systems, something changes. The activity declines. The structures are no longer maintained. And the canyon becomes quiet again. The reasons for this shift are not fully understood, with possibilities including environmental changes, resource limitations, or shifts in the broader network that connected these sites. But what remains is the structure. The walls still stand, the layout is still visible, and the system can still be traced, even if not fully explained. And that creates a different kind of presence, because the great houses do not simply exist as ruins. They exist as evidence of planning, of coordination, of a system that once functioned across a wide region. And maybe that is what makes Chaco Canyon stand out, because it shows that complexity does not always leave behind clear explanations. Sometimes it leaves behind patterns, structures that suggest organization, but do not fully reveal how that organization was achieved. And that leaves space for interpretation, not as speculation, but as an ongoing process of understanding something that is still only partially known. And even now, standing in the canyon, surrounded by these structures, the sense of design is still present. Not in a complete form, but in fragments that connect. Walls, rooms, alignments. All pointing towards something that was built with intention, maintained over time, and then left behind in a way that still allows it to be seen. Not fully understood, but clearly deliberate. The stone circle on the mountain. In the highlands of Mpumalanga, South Africa, where rolling hills stretch outward beneath a wide sky and the landscape feels both open and quietly isolated, there is a formation of stones that does not immediately present itself as a structure in the traditional sense, yet becomes more defined the longer it is observed. This is often referred to as Adam's calendar. At first glance, the site appears simple, consisting of upright stones arranged in a rough circular formation, weathered by time and partially embedded in the ground, giving the impression that they have always been there, shaped gradually by natural processes rather than deliberate placement. But closer inspection suggests something different, because the stones are not scattered randomly across the hillside, but positioned in a way that forms a pattern, one that holds its shape even after long exposure to the elements. And that raises the central question: was this arrangement intentional? Because if it was, then it represents a structure that predates many of the more widely known stone circles, with some claims suggesting extreme antiquity, although those claims remain debated and not fully supported by established archaeological consensus. What can be observed directly is the layout itself, which forms an elliptical or circular arrangement, with certain stones standing taller than others, creating points that appear to define the shape of the formation. And within that shape, there are indications of alignment, with some researchers suggesting that the positioning of the stones corresponds to solar movements, allowing the site to function as a kind of observational marker for the rising or setting sun during specific times of the year. If that interpretation is accurate, then the structure becomes more than a simple arrangement of stones, because it introduces the idea that the site was used to track time, or at least to observe recurring patterns in the environment. And that idea appears across many ancient cultures, where the movement of the sun, the changing of seasons, and the repetition of natural cycles are recorded not through written systems, but through alignment and construction. But in this case, the evidence remains uncertain because the site has not been studied in the same way as more established archaeological locations, and much of what is suggested about it exists between observation and interpretation. And that uncertainty is part of what defines it. Because the structure is visible, the stones are present, the arrangement is real, but the meaning behind it is not fully confirmed. And that creates a different kind of space, not one of complete mystery, but one where the available information does not fully resolve the questions that arise from what can be seen. The stones themselves show signs of age, shaped by weathering and exposure, with surfaces that reflect long periods of interaction with the environment, yet their placement remains stable, suggesting that whatever forces have acted on them over time have not been enough to disrupt the overall pattern. And that stability is important because it allows the structure to retain its form, even if its original purpose is no longer clearly understood. The location also contributes to its significance, because being positioned on elevated ground provides visibility across the surrounding landscape, creating a vantage point that connects the site to the horizon, which is often a key element in structures that are associated with observation. And that connection between ground and horizon appears repeatedly in ancient sites, where elevation is used to extend visibility and to align structures with distant points that mark the movement of celestial bodies. But without clear evidence of construction methods, dating, or associated artifacts, the interpretation of Adam's calendar remains open, existing in a space where observation suggests intention, but confirmation is limited. And that makes it different from other sites, because instead of presenting a clear narrative supported by excavation and study, it presents a form that invites interpretation while resisting definitive explanation. And that does not reduce its significance. If anything, it shifts it, because the value of the site lies not only in what is known but in what can be observed directly. The arrangement of stones, the shape they create, and the way that shape interacts with the surrounding environment. And that interaction is still visible, the circle remains, the stones hold their positions, the pattern is intact, and that continuity allows the structure to exist as a point of reference even if its full context is not fully established. And maybe that is what makes Adam's calendar stand out, because it sits between categories, not fully defined as a confirmed ancient observatory, not fully dismissed as a natural formation, but existing in a space where both possibilities are considered. And that space is not empty. It is filled with observation, with the process of trying to understand how a structure like this came to exist and what it may have meant to those who first interacted with it. And even now, standing on that hillside, looking across the stones and the landscape beyond, the arrangement continues to hold its form, quiet, unchanged, and still suggesting that something was placed here with intention, even if that intention is not yet fully understood. The stone tower complex on the plain. In the central region of Sardinia, where the land stretches outward in a mix of open plains and low hills, there is a structure that does not immediately appear as a single building, but rather as a formation of stone rising from the ground in a way that feels both deliberate and layered. This is Nuraghe su Nuraxi. And what makes it unusual is not just its form, but the way it expands beyond what might first be assumed, revealing itself as a complex rather than an isolated structure with multiple elements working together to create something that is both defensive and communal at the same time. At the center stands a massive stone tower, built from large basalt blocks that are carefully stacked without mortar, forming a conical shape that rises upward with a sense of weight and stability that reflects a deep understanding of balance and construction. The interior of the central tower is not solid but hollow, containing a chamber that narrows as it rises, with walls that curve inward in a corbelled design, allowing the structure to support itself through the placement of each stone rather than through any binding material. And that method of construction is significant because it shows that the builders understood how to distribute weight in a way that allows the structure to endure over long periods, resisting collapse even as the environment around it changes. But the central tower is only part of the structure. Surrounding it are additional towers, connected by walls that create an outer enclosure, forming a defensive complex that expands the function of the site beyond a single point. turning it into a system of interconnected spaces. And that system continues outward, because beyond the inner complex there are remains of a village, with circular huts arranged in a pattern that suggests organized living, creating a settlement that is directly connected to the central structure. And that connection changes how the site is understood, because now it is not just a tower, it is a community, a place where people lived, interacted, and organized themselves around a central point that likely held significance beyond simple residence. The entire complex dates back to the Bronze Age, around 1500 BCE, and is associated with the Nuragic civilization, a culture unique to Sardinia that developed its own architectural style, centered around these tower structures. And that style appears across the island, with thousands of nuraghi built in different forms, suggesting a shared system of construction and a widespread understanding of how these structures functioned. But Sunuraxi stands out because of its scale and preservation, because here, the layers are still visible. The central tower, the surrounding walls, the outer settlement, all connected, all part of a single system. And that system reflects organization, because building something like this requires coordination at multiple levels, from gathering materials to arranging labor to maintaining the structure over time, and that level of effort implies a society capable of sustaining long-term projects. And then there is the question of purpose, because while the defensive aspects of the structure are clear, the full function of nuraghi remains debated, with possibilities ranging from fortresses to communal centers to symbols of status or authority. And that uncertainty remains, because the structure provides evidence of use, but not a complete explanation of its role. And that creates a space for interpretation, because the design suggests multiple functions: defense, residence, observation, all integrated into a single complex, and that integration reflects flexibility, a system that can serve different purposes depending on the needs of the people who use it. And then there is the relationship with the surrounding landscape, because the structure does not exist in isolation. It is positioned within a wider environment, connected to other sites, forming part of a network that extends across the region, suggesting that these complexes were not independent, but linked in ways that are still being explored. And that connection adds another layer, because it implies communication, coordination beyond a single location, a broader system that operates across distance. And that complexity is not always visible in the structure itself, but it is suggested by its placement and its repetition across the landscape. And then, over time, the site changes. The original use declines. The structures remain, but the activity fades. And what is left is the form, the stone, the layout, the system that once functioned, now preserved in a quieter state. And that creates a different kind of presence, because even without the people, the structure still communicates something, not through words, but through form, through the way the stones are placed, through the way the space is organized. And that communication is still visible, because the tower still stands, the walls still define boundaries, the village still outlines the life that once existed here. And maybe that is what makes Nuraghe Sunuraxi stand out, because it represents not just a structure, but a system, a way of building that reflects organization, understanding, and continuity over time. And even now, standing within the complex, surrounded by stone that has remained in place for thousands of years, the sense of design is still present, not fully explained, but clearly deliberate, and still holding the shape of something that was built to endure. The long barrow beneath the earth. In the countryside of southern England, where the landscape unfolds in gentle hills and open fields shaped by time and quiet continuity, there is a structure that does not immediately reveal its complexity, appearing instead as a long mound of earth stretching across the ground, subtle in form yet unmistakably deliberate in its presence. This is West Kennet Long Barrow, At first glance, it seems simple, a raised shape in the landscape, covered in grass, blending into its surroundings in a way that makes it feel almost natural, as if it has always been part of the land rather than something constructed. But beneath that surface lies a carefully designed structure, built with stone and earth in a way that reflects both intention and understanding, dating back to around 3600 BCE. This long barrow belongs to the early Neolithic period, a time when communities began to shape the land not only for living, but for meaning, creating structures that connect the physical world with ideas that extend beyond immediate survival. The mound itself stretches for nearly 100 meters, forming an elongated shape that differs from the circular cairns and tombs found elsewhere, suggesting that its design was guided by a different set of principles, possibly related to how space was used and experienced. At one end of the mound, there is an entrance, a defined opening that leads into a passage constructed from large stone slabs, forming walls and a ceiling that guide movement inward, creating a transition from the open landscape into an enclosed interior space. And that transition is gradual. As you move through the passage, the light begins to fade, the outside world recedes, and the structure begins to take on a different quality, one that feels separate from the environment above it, contained and deliberate. The passage leads into a series of chambers, arranged along its length, each one formed by upright stones that create defined spaces within the mound, and these chambers were used for burial, with human remains placed inside them over extended periods of time. And that repeated use is important, because it suggests that the barrow was not a single event, but a place that was returned to, revisited, and maintained as part of an ongoing process that connected generations. Objects found within the chambers indicate that these spaces were not used randomly, but with care, suggesting that the placement of remains and items followed patterns that carried meaning within the community. And that meaning may have been connected to ideas of ancestry, memory, and continuity, creating a link between the living and those who came before, all contained within the same structure. The construction itself reflects a deep understanding of material and form, with large stones used to create stable chambers that are then covered by earth, forming the mound that protects and conceals the interior. And that concealment changes how the structure is experienced, because from the outside it appears minimal, almost understated, while inside the complexity becomes clear, creating a contrast between what is visible and what is hidden. And that contrast is deliberate, because it requires entry to fully understand the structure, turning it into a space that is not simply observed but experienced through movement. And that movement is controlled. The passage is narrow. The chambers are enclosed. Each step inward creates a shift, not only in space, but in perception. And that suggests that the act of entering the barrow was part of its purpose, not separate from it. The location of West Kennet Long Barrow also connects it to a wider landscape of Neolithic monuments, including nearby stone circles and avenues, forming part of a larger system that reflects coordinated activity across the region. And that system implies connection. Not isolated construction, but a network of sites that share relationships in placement, orientation, and possibly purpose. And that adds another layer of complexity, because now the barrow is not only a structure, it is part of something larger, a landscape that has been shaped with intention. And that intention extends beyond individual sites. It connects them, creates patterns, and suggests a broader understanding of space. And then, over time, the use of the barrow changes. The chambers are no longer accessed in the same way. The structure remains, but the activity fades, and what is left is the form, the mound, the chambers beneath it, the system that once functioned, now preserved in a quieter state. And that preservation allows us to see something clearly, not just the structure itself, but the way it was built to endure. The stones still hold. The chambers remain intact, and the overall shape continues to define the landscape. And maybe that is what makes West Kennet Long Barrow stand out, because it shows how something can say to be both simple in appearance and complex in design. How a structure can conceal its purpose while still holding it intact, and how meaning can be embedded into the ground in a way that lasts far beyond the time of its creators. And even now, standing on that mound, looking across the surrounding fields, it is easy to see only the surface. But beneath it, the structure remains, defined, deliberate, and still holding the shape of something that was built thousands of years ago, not just to exist, but to be returned to, remembered, and understood in ways that are still being explored. The stone houses without streets. On the island of Cyprus, where the land meets the eastern Mediterranean and the terrain shifts between low hills and open plains, there is a site that does not immediately appear as a city in the way we expect, but slowly reveals a form of living that feels structured in a completely different way. This is Kirokitia. At first, it appears as a collection of low circular foundations scattered across a hillside, built from stone that blends into the surrounding ground, giving the impression that the structures are part of the landscape rather than placed upon it. But as the layout becomes clearer, the pattern begins to emerge, and what seemed scattered starts to feel organized, shaped by a system that does not follow the rules of later urban design. Dating back to around 7000 BCE, Kirokitia belongs to a period when permanent settlement was still developing, when communities were beginning to establish stable living spaces while still forming the systems that would later define cities. And here, that transition is visible. The houses are circular, not rectangular, not aligned along straight paths, but built as individual units that connect to one another in a dense arrangement, forming a settlement where boundaries between spaces are not always clearly defined in the way we might expect. And that changes how movement works, because there are no formal streets. Instead, movement happens between structures, over thresholds, through spaces that are created by the positioning of the houses themselves, creating a network that is less about open pathways and more about connection. And that connection is physical. The houses are built close together, sometimes sharing walls, sometimes separated by narrow gaps that act as informal passages. And that creates a settlement that feels compact, integrated, and continuous. Inside the houses, the space is carefully arranged. Raised platforms are used for sleeping and activity. Hearths are positioned for cooking. Storage areas are built into the structure. And all of this exists within a circular form that creates a contained environment, one that feels enclosed yet functional. The walls are constructed from stone at the base, with upper sections that may have included lighter materials, and the roofs were likely flat, allowing for use of the upper surface as an additional space, which adds another layer to how the settlement functioned. Because now the house is not just an interior, it is also a surface, a space that can be used for movement, for activity, and possibly for connection between structures. And that suggests a vertical dimension to the settlement. Not just horizontal movement across the ground, but interaction above it. And that changes the experience of the space. Because instead of open streets, there is a network of surfaces and connections that define how people move and interact. And then there is the boundary of the settlement itself. Because Kirokitia is enclosed by a wall, built from stone, forming a perimeter that separates the interior from the surrounding landscape. And that boundary suggests control, not necessarily in the sense of defense alone, but in defining where the settlement begins and ends, creating a clear distinction between inside and outside. And that distinction is important, because it reflects an early understanding of organized space, a recognition that a community can be contained, defined, and structured within limits. And then there are the burials, because beneath the floors of the houses, human remains have been found, placed within the living space itself, suggesting that the separation between daily life and death was not as distinct as it is in later societies. And that integration changes the meaning of the house, because it is not only a place for the living, it becomes a place of continuity, where generations exist within the same space. And that creates a different relationship between people and place. Not temporary, but sustained, connected over time. And that continuity is reflected in the layers of the site, because the settlement was used over long periods, with structures rebuilt, modified, and maintained, creating a record of activity that extends across generations. And that record is not written. It is built, layer by layer, stone by stone. And that is what allows us to see it now, not as a single moment, but as a process. A development of living space that shows how early communities organized themselves, not through large monumental structures, but through consistent patterns repeated over time. And that makes Kirikitia different, because it does not rely on scale to demonstrate complexity. It shows complexity through arrangement, through connection, through the way space is used and shared. And maybe that is what makes it stand out, because it captures a moment when the idea of a settlement was still being formed, when the systems we now associate with cities were not yet fully defined, and when people were experimenting with how to live together in a structured environment. And even now, walking through the remains, the pattern is still visible. The circular forms, the close arrangement, the boundaries that define the space, all of it still suggests that this was not random. It was designed, not in the rigid sense of later planning, but in a way that reflects understanding, adaptation, and continuity. And that understanding remains, embedded in the stone, holding the shape of a community that existed thousands of years ago, and still offering a glimpse into how people began to build not just structures, but ways of living. The standing stones of the highlands. In the highlands of southern Armenia, where the land rises into rolling plateaus and the horizon feels distant under a wide and open sky, there is a site where stones stand upright in a formation that does not immediately explain itself, yet holds a presence that feels deliberate the longer it is observed. This is Karahunj, sometimes referred to as Zoret's Karer. At first glance, the site appears as a scattering of large stones, weathered by time and shaped by exposure to the elements, positioned across the ground in a pattern that is not entirely obvious from a single viewpoint, but begins to reveal structure when seen as a whole. The stones are arranged in lines and clusters, extending outward from a central area that forms a loose circle, creating a layout that suggests organization rather than randomness, with each stone placed in a position that contributes to the overall shape of the site. Some of the stones are taller than others, rising above the ground with a presence that draws attention, while others are smaller, forming connections between different sections, creating a network of placement that feels intentional even if its exact meaning is not immediately clear. One of the most distinctive features of Karahunj is that several of the stones contain circular holes carved through them, openings that appear to have been created deliberately, positioned in ways that suggest they may have been used for observation or alignment. And that detail introduces one of the most discussed interpretations of the site, that it may have functioned as a form of observatory, because when viewed in relation to the horizon, some of these holes appear to align with specific points where celestial bodies rise or set, suggesting that the stones could have been used to track movements in the sky over time. If this interpretation holds, then the site becomes more than a collection of standing stones. It becomes a system, way of observing patterns that repeat, a method of connecting the ground to the sky. And that idea is not isolated. Similar concepts appear in other ancient sites across different regions, where alignment and observation are built into the placement of structures, reflecting an understanding of cycles that extend beyond the immediate environment. But in the case of Karahunj, the evidence remains debated, with different interpretations offering varying conclusions about its age and purpose. And while some claims suggest extreme antiquity, others place it within a more recent time frame, leaving the full context of the site open to discussion. And that uncertainty becomes part of its identity, because what is clearly visible is the arrangement, the stones, the pattern. but what that pattern represents is not fully resolved. And that creates a space where observation leads to questions that do not have simple answers. The location itself adds to that sense of purpose because the site is positioned on elevated ground, providing a clear view of the surrounding landscape and the horizon, which is often a key factor in sites associated with observation. From this vantage point, the movement of the sun, the changing of light, and the shifting position of celestial bodies become more apparent, creating a connection between the site and the broader environment that extends beyond the immediate placement of the stones. And that connection suggests that the builders were not only working with the ground beneath them, but also with the sky above them, integrating both into the structure in a way that reflects awareness of patterns that repeat over time. The construction itself, while not involving complex masonry or enclosed spaces, still requires effort because each stone had to be selected, moved, and positioned with care. And the consistency of the arrangement suggests that this process was guided by intention rather than chance, and that intention is what holds the site together. Because even without complete understanding of its purpose, the structure remains coherent, the lines connect, the circle forms, the pattern holds, and that coherence is not something that develops randomly. It is created. And then there is the passage of time, because the stones have remained in place for centuries, exposed to weather, to environmental change, and to the gradual processes that shape the land, yet the overall formation is still visible, still recognizable, still intact enough to suggest what it once was. And that endurance allows the site to continue existing as a point of reference, not only for those who study it, but for anyone who observes it, because the structure does not require full explanation to be recognized as intentional. And maybe that is what makes Karahunch stand out, because it exists in a space between certainty and interpretation, not fully defined, not fully explained, but clearly constructed, and that balance and creates a different kind of significance, because it allows the site to be understood in layers. What is visible? What is suggested? What is still unknown? And those layers do not cancel each other out. They exist together, forming a structure that continues to invite observation not as a puzzle to be solved quickly, but as something that requires time, attention, and consideration. And even now, standing among the stones, looking across the lines and the open landscape beyond, the pattern remains. Not complete in explanation, but complete in form, and still holding the presence of something that was placed here with intention, shaped into the land in a way that continues to suggest that it was meant to be observed, understood, and perhaps even used in ways that are not yet fully known. The recumbent stones aligned with the horizon, in the northeastern part of Scotland, across the landscape of Aberdeenshire, where fields stretch between low hills and the sky often feels wide and uninterrupted. There are stone circles that at first appear similar to others found across Britain, yet reveal a distinct pattern the longer they are observed. These are the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire. At a distance, they appear simple, a ring of upright stones arranged in a circular formation, weathered by time and standing quietly within the landscape. Their surface is marked by centuries of exposure to wind, rain, and seasonal change. But as the structure becomes clearer, one feature stands out. A single large stone, set on its side, positioned deliberately along the circumference of the circle. This is the recumbent stone, and it changes the entire meaning of the structure. Because unlike the upright stones that form the rest of the circle, this stone lies horizontally, flanked by two taller stones on either side, creating a defined focal point that anchors the entire arrangement. And that focal point is not placed randomly, it is aligned, positioned toward a specific direction on the horizon, often associated with the southern sky, where the movement of the moon and certain celestial events become visible. And that alignment suggests intention, because building a circle is not only about placing stones at equal distances, it is about orientation, about how the structure relates to the world beyond it. And here, that relationship appears to connect the circle to cycles in the sky. The positioning of the recumbent stone and its flanking stones creates a frame, a defined viewing point, through which certain events may have been observed, particularly movements of the moon during specific phases. And that introduces the idea that these circles were not only markers on the ground, but instruments of observation, not in the modern scientific sense, but as structured spaces that allow patterns in the sky to be recognized and repeated over time. And that repetition is important because observing cycles requires consistency. You need to return to the same place at the same time over long periods. And structures like this provide that stability. They fix a point in the landscape. They create a reference, and that reference allows patterns to be tracked. But the purpose of these circles may not have been limited to observation alone, because the structure also defines space. The circle encloses an area, creates a boundary, and that boundary can carry meaning, separating one type of space from another, creating a place that is distinct from its surroundings. And that distinction is often associated with gathering, with activity that is not part of everyday movement, but part of something more structured, possibly ceremonial, possibly social. And that combination of functions is not uncommon in ancient sites, where structures serve multiple roles: observation, gathering, symbolism, all integrated into a single form. And then there is the construction itself, because the stones used in these circles are large, often sourced from the surrounding area, shaped minimally, but placed with care, ensuring that each one contributes to the overall stability and form of the structure. And that placement requires effort. The stones must be moved, positioned, aligned with precision, and that precision is not always exact in a geometric sense, but it is consistent enough to maintain the pattern across different sites, because these circles are not isolated. They appear across the region, repeated, with similar design, similar orientation. And that repetition suggests a shared understanding, a method that was known and applied across multiple locations, and that requires communication, a way of passing knowledge from one group to another, or from one generation to the next. And that continuity is visible in the consistency of the structures. And then there is the passage of time, because these circles have remained in place for thousands of years, exposed to environmental change, yet still holding their form, still marking the landscape in a way that is immediately recognizable. And that endurance reflects something important. Because the design works, the stones remain upright, the circle holds its shape, the alignment persists, and that persistence allows the structure to continue functioning as a reference, even if its original purpose is no longer fully understood. And maybe that is what makes the recumbent stone circles stand out, because they are not just arrangements of stone, they are systems, defined by placement, by orientation, by the relationship between the ground and the sky. And that relationship is still visible, not in explanation, but in form, in the way the stones are arranged, in the way the circle holds, and in the way the recumbent stone anchors the entire structure to a specific point on the horizon. And even now, standing within one of these circles, looking toward that stone and the landscape beyond it, the sense of alignment is still present, not fully explained, but clearly intentional, and still holding the shape of something that was built to connect the land, the sky, and the patterns that move between them. The rock-cut tombs above the sea. On the island of Minorca, where the coastline is shaped by cliffs and the sea stretches outward under a wide horizon, there is a place where the rock itself has been carved into forms that do not immediately reveal their purpose, yet clearly carry the marks of deliberate human work. This is Ezcol de Cala Morel. At first, the site appears as a rocky slope overlooking the water, with openings cut into the stone that resemble natural cavities, shaped by erosion and time, blending into the landscape in a way that makes them easy to overlook from a distance. But as you move closer, the pattern becomes clear, and what seemed natural begins to show structure, repetition, and intention. because these are not natural formations. They are tombs, carved directly into the rock, and that changes how the site is understood. Because instead of building upward with stone, the people who created this place chose to remove material, shaping space by cutting into the ground itself. Each chamber is hollowed out with care, forming interior spaces that vary in size and shape, with walls that are smoothed and defined, creating rooms that feel constructed even though they are carved from a single mass of stone. The entrances are positioned along the slope, often facing outward toward the sea, creating a relationship between the interior space and the open horizon. A connection that suggests the placement was not only practical, but also considered in relation to the surrounding environment. Inside, the chambers sometimes include carved benches, niches, and divisions that suggest organization within the space, indicating that these were not simple cavities, but structured interiors designed for specific use, and that use was burial. Human remains have been found within these chambers, along with objects that indicate repeated activity, suggesting that the site was used over time, not as a single event, but as a place that was returned to across generations. And that continuity matters, because it shows that the site held significance beyond immediate need, becoming part of a system of memory, where the placement of the dead was connected to a specific location that remained constant over time. The act of carving into rock requires effort that is different from construction, because instead of assembling materials, it involves removing them, shaping solid stone into hollow space, which requires tools, time, and a clear understanding of how the material behaves. And that process is controlled, because once the stone is removed, it cannot be replaced. Each cut is permanent, which means the design must be understood before it is created. And that suggests planning, not only in the layout of individual chambers, but in how they are arranged across the slope, forming a site that feels organized even without formal boundaries or walls. The positioning of the tombs creates a kind of layered landscape where each chamber exists as part of a larger composition, connected visually and spatially, forming a network of spaces that share the same function but differ in detail. And that variation is important, because it suggests that the site developed over time, with new chambers added as needed, adapting to the requirements of the community while maintaining a consistent approach to design. And that approach reflects understanding of space, of material, and of how to create something that lasts. Because once carved, these chambers endure. They are protected by the rock itself, resistant to change, and that durability allows the site to remain visible even after its original use has ended. Over time, the activity fades. The chambers are no longer used in the same way. The tools are gone, the people are gone, but the structure remains. The openings are still visible, the interiors still hold their form, and the pattern across the slope is still clear, and that creates a different UI kind of presence. Because unlike structures built from separate materials, these tombs are part of the land itself. They cannot collapse in the same way. They cannot be easily removed. They remain because they are the landscape. And maybe that is what makes Escol de Calamorel stand out, because it represents a different approach to building, one that does not add to the environment, but transforms it, creating space by shaping what is already there. And that transformation is still visible, not in fragments, but in the rock itself, holding the marks of deliberate action. And even now, standing above the sea, looking across the carved openings and the horizon beyond, the site continues to suggest that this was not just a place of burial. It was a place of connection. Between people and land, between memory and location. And that connection remains. Defined in stone, quiet, but still present. The stone fortress above the plain. In eastern Turkey, where the land opens into wide plains framed by distant mountains, and the horizon stretches under a steady, quiet sky. There is a structure that rises above its surroundings, with a presence that it immediately suggests control, not just of space, but of movement across the landscape. This is Çavuştepe, built during the 8th century BCE. This site belongs to the Kingdom of Urartu, a civilization that developed in this region with a strong emphasis on fortified construction, creating structures that were not only meant to endure, but to project authority across the territories they occupied. Çavuştepe itself is positioned on a ridge, elevated above the surrounding land in a way that provides clear visibility in multiple directions, allowing those within the fortress to observe movement across the plains, creating an advantage that is both natural and intentional. The structure is not a single building, but a complex divided into upper and lower sections, each with its own function, connected through a system of walls and pathways that define how the space is used and controlled. The walls are constructed from large stone blocks, forming a solid base that supports upper sections that were likely built from mud brick, a combination that reflects both durability and efficiency, allowing the structure to maintain strength while adapting to the available materials. And that construction is deliberate, because the walls are not only boundaries, they are defenses, designed to resist intrusion, to control access, and to create a separation between the interior of the fortress and the world outside it. The entrances are limited and positioned in ways that allow them to be monitored, ensuring that movement into the structure is never uncontrolled, reinforcing the idea that this was a place where access was managed carefully. Inside the fortress, the layout reveals organization. Rooms are arranged in defined sections. Storage areas are positioned strategically. Spaces for activity are separated from areas of control, and that arrangement reflects planning, not only in construction, but in function, because every part of the structure serves a purpose. The upper citadel likely held administrative or ceremonial functions, elevated both physically and symbolically above the rest of the site, while the lower sections supported daily activity, creating a layered system where different roles are reflected in different spaces. And that layering is important because it shows that the fortress was not only defensive, it was operational, a place where systems were maintained, where resources were stored, where authority was exercised. And that authority is visible in the scale of the construction, because building something like this requires coordination, labor, and a system capable of organizing those elements over time, suggesting a centralized power that directed the effort, and that aligns with what is known about Urartian society, where fortified sites like this were part of a broader network, connected across the region to form a system of control that extended beyond individual locations. And that connection adds another layer, because Çavuştepe is not isolated. It is part of something larger, a network of fortresses that communicate, support, and reinforce each other. And that system requires structure, not just in architecture, but in organization, in how information moves, how resources are distributed, how control is maintained across distance. And then there is the environment, because the region is not always stable. Conditions change, pressures shift. And fortresses like this are built in response to those conditions, reflecting a need for security and control in a landscape that requires it. Over time, however, the system changes. The fortress is no longer maintained in the same way. The activity declines, and what remains is the structure. The stone walls continue to define the space, the layout remains visible, but the function fades, and that creates a different kind of presence. Because even without the people who built and used it, the design still communicates its purpose. Not through words, but through form. Through the way the walls rise, through the way the space is divided, and through the way the entire structure sits above the landscape, maintaining a position that reflects its original role. And maybe that is what makes Çavuştepe stand out, because it represents a moment where construction, organization, and authority come together in a single structure, creating a place that was not only built to exist, but built to control. And even now, standing on that ridge, looking across the plains below, the sense of that control is still present. Not active, but visible, defined in stone, and still holding the outline of a system that once shaped the landscape around it. The Oracle Temple in the desert. In the western desert of Egypt, far from the dense concentration of monuments along the Nile, there is a place where the landscape changes into something quieter, more isolated, where palm groves emerge from the sand and natural springs sustain life, in a region otherwise defined by dryness and distance. This is the Siwa Oasis, and within it stands the Temple of Ammon. What makes this site unusual is not only its location, but the role it played, because this was not simply a place of construction or settlement, but a place associated with answers, with decisions, and with the act of seeking guidance from something beyond immediate human control. The temple itself is built from stone, positioned on elevated ground that overlooks the surrounding oasis, creating a presence that is both visible and separate, establishing a boundary between the structure and the landscape around it. And that separation matters, because it defines the temple not just as a building, but as a destination, a place people would travel to, and that journey is part of its meaning. Because reaching Siwa is not simple. It requires crossing desert, distance, isolation. And that effort creates significance. Because places that require effort to reach often carry importance beyond their physical form. And that importance is reflected in the temple's association with the Oracle of Amun, a system through which individuals sought answers, guidance, or confirmation of decisions, often related to leadership, conflict, or direction. And this was not symbolic in a vague sense, it was specific. People came here expecting responses, expecting clarity. And that expectation shaped how the site functioned. The temple's interior would have been structured to support that process, with spaces that control movement, guided individuals through specific paths, and created an environment that separated ordinary experience from something more focused and deliberate. And that control of space is important, because it shapes perception, it creates atmosphere, and it reinforces the idea that what happens within the structure is different from what happens outside it. And that difference is central to places associated with oracles, because they are not only about answers, they are about how those answers are received, and that experience is constructed through architecture, through movement, through environment. And then there is the historical context, because this temple is famously associated with Alexander the Great, who is said to have traveled to Siwa in 331 BCE to consult the oracle, seeking confirmation of his status and authority. And whether every detail of that account is exact or not, the journey itself reflects the importance of the site, because it shows that even those with power and control sought validation from a place that existed beyond their immediate influence. And that adds another layer, because now the temple is not only a local structure, it becomes part of a wider network of significance, recognized across regions, sought after by those who held influence, and that recognition reinforces its role, not as a passive site, but as an active point of interaction. And then there is the environment itself, because Siwa is not an ordinary location, it is isolated, surrounded by desert, and sustained by water sources that create life in an otherwise harsh landscape. And that contrast adds meaning, because the presence of water in such a place creates a sense of rarity, of something valuable, and that value extends to the structures built within it, making them part of a landscape that already feels distinct. And that distinction enhances the experience of the site, because it is not only the temple that feels separate, it is the entire environment, and that environment shapes how the structure is perceived. And then, over time, the function changes. The oracle is no longer active, the temple is no longer used in the same way. And what remains is the structure, the stone, the layout, the elevated position above the oasis, and that creates a different kind of presence, because even without its original function, the site still holds the form that once supported it. The pathways still exist, the boundaries remain, and the sense of separation is still visible. And maybe that is what makes the Temple of Ammon at Siwa stand out, because it represents a type of structure that is not only built for physical use but for experience, for interaction, for the act of seeking something that cannot be measured in the same way as stone or space. And even now, standing in that desert environment, looking at the remains of the temple against the horizon, the sense of distance is still present, not only in space, but in time. Because what remains is not the answers that were once given there, but the place where they were sought. And that place still holds its form, quiet, defined, and still carrying the outline of a function that shaped how people understood decisions, authority, and the unknown. The stone structures in the cliff walls, in the high desert of northern New Mexico, where mesas rise above deep canyons and the land carries the layered marks of volcanic stone and erosion, there is a place where human construction does not sit on the ground in the usual way, but instead becomes part of the cliffs themselves. This is Bandelier. What makes this site unusual is not only the structures that are visible, but the way they are integrated into the landscape, combining built stone walls with spaces carved directly into the soft volcanic rock, creating a system that exists both within and upon the surface of the cliffs. Along the canyon walls, openings appear in patterns that suggest intention rather than erosion, leading into cavities that have been shaped and expanded to form rooms, each one positioned in a way that takes advantage of the natural material while still reflecting deliberate design. And these spaces are not isolated, they are connected. Paths, ladders, and routes once linked different levels of the cliff, creating a vertical network of movement that allowed access between areas that are now separated by height and distance. And that vertical arrangement changes how the settlement is understood, because instead of expanding outward across flat ground, it rises upward along the rock face, using elevation as part of its structure, creating a layered environment where different levels serve different functions. At the base of the cliffs, stone-built structures form additional rooms constructed from shaped blocks that create walls and define spaces, extending the settlement beyond the carved interiors and forming a combination of natural and built architecture. And that combination reflects adaptation, because the people who lived here did not rely on a single method of construction. They used what the environment provided, carving where the rock allowed it, building where it did not. And that flexibility is important because it shows an understanding of material, of how to work with the landscape rather than against it. The site dates to the ancestral Pueblo people, who occupied this region for centuries, developing systems of living that were closely tied to the environment, balancing the need for shelter, storage, and community within a landscape that required careful management. And that management is visible in the layout, because the structures are not placed randomly. They follow patterns, clusters of rooms, shared spaces, defined areas for activity, and that suggests organization, not only in construction, but in daily life. Because living in a space like this requires coordination. Movement must be understood, access must be maintained, and that creates a system where space is used efficiently and consistently. The placement of the structures within the cliffs also provides natural protection, both from environmental factors and from potential threats, using elevation and enclosure to create spaces that are secure without requiring extensive additional fortification. And that reflects strategy. Because instead of building defenses outward, the environment itself becomes part of the protection, and that integration is one of the defining features of the site. Because the structures do not stand apart from the cliffs. They are part of them. And that connection creates a different kind of presence. Because the boundary between natural and constructed becomes less clear, blending into a single system that feels cohesive rather than separate. Inside the carved rooms, surfaces are smoothed, spaces are defined, and features such as storage, niches, and hearths indicate that these were not temporary shelters, but places of sustained living, used over time as part of a stable community. And that stability is important because it shows that the site was not used briefly. It was maintained, developed, adapted across generations, and that continuity leaves a mark, not only in the structures themselves, but in the arrangement, in the way the space is organized, and in the way the entire settlement functions as a system. And then, as with many ancient sites, there is a shift. The occupation declines. The structures are no longer used in the same way, and the site becomes quiet, but the form remains. The openings in the cliffs are still visible. The stone walls still define the lower structures, and the vertical arrangement is still clear, and that creates a lasting presence. Because even without the people, the system is still readable, not in complete detail, but in enough clarity to understand that this was not random. It was designed, and maybe that is what makes Bandelier stand out, because it shows how architecture can adapt to environment in a way that does not impose itself, but instead works with what is already there, creating a balance between construction and landscape. And even now, standing within the canyon, looking up at the cliff walls and the openings carved into them, the sense of structure is still present, not separate from the land, but embedded within it, and still holding the outline of a way of living that was shaped as much by the environment as by the people who built within it. The temple marked by giant footprints. In northern Syria, where the land rises into gentle elevations surrounded by open plains, there is a site where the remains of a temple still outline a structure that once stood with clarity, symmetry, and a presence that extended beyond its physical form. This is Ain Dara Temple. What makes this site unusual is not only the architecture itself, but a detail that appears almost out of place when first seen: a series of large carved footprints embedded into the stone floor, positioned in a way that suggests movement through the temple, rather than decoration. The temple dates back to the early 1st millennium BCE, associated with the Neo-Hittite period, a time when regional cultures were developing complex architectural forms that combined structure, symbolism, and controlled space into unified designs. The layout of the temple follows a clear plan, beginning with an outer courtyard that leads inward toward the main building, creating a progression of space that guides movement step by step, establishing a transition from the open exterior into a more defined and enclosed interior. As one moves through this progression, the structure becomes more controlled, with raised platforms, carved stone elements, and defined thresholds that mark each stage of entry, reinforcing the idea that the experience of the temple was not random, but carefully directed. And that direction is important, because it shapes how the space is understood. It creates a sequence, a movement from outside to inside, from open to enclosed, from ordinary space to something more focused. And that sequence is a defining feature of many ancient temples, where architecture is used not only to contain activity, but to guide perception and experience. The construction itself reflects a high level of skill, with large stone blocks forming the base and lower sections, while upper parts likely included additional materials that have not survived, creating a structure that was both durable and visually defined. Carvings decorate parts of the temple, including reliefs of animals and symbolic figures, suggesting that the site carried meaning beyond its physical form, representing ideas, beliefs, or identities that were expressed through the structure. And then there are the footprints, large, carved, positioned in pairs, leading inward through the temple. And this feature stands out because it suggests presence, not of those who walked there in a literal sense, but of something represented, because the scale of the footprints is larger than human, creating the impression of a figure that is not meant to be understood as ordinary but as symbolic, possibly representing a deity entering the temple space. And that interpretation changes how the structure is understood, because now the temple is not only a place where people go, it becomes a place where something else is imagined to arrive. And that idea transforms the space, because it introduces movement that is not physical, but conceptual, embedded into the architecture itself. And that is a powerful design because it shapes how people interact with the space, how they perceive it, and how they understand its purpose. The temple's orientation and layout also suggest alignment with the surrounding environment, positioned in a way that connects it to the landscape while still maintaining a distinct identity, separating it from ordinary structures. And that separation is important because it defines the temple as a place set apart, not part of daily life, but part of something structured, something intentional. And that intention is visible in every part of the design, from the entrance, to the inner chambers, to the carved details. All of it works together, creating a system, not only of space, but of meaning. And then there is the passage of time, because the temple no longer stands in its complete form. Sections have been lost, damaged, but enough remains to show the layout, the foundation, the carvings, the footprints. And that is enough, because the structure can still be understood, not fully, but clearly enough to recognize that it was built with purpose. And that purpose was not limited to function alone. It extended into representation, into the way space is used to convey ideas. And maybe that is what makes Aindara stand out, because it shows how architecture can move beyond structure, becoming a medium through which meaning is expressed not only in what is built, but in how it is experienced. And even now, standing within the remains of the temple, looking at the carved footprints leading inward, the sense of movement is still present, not visible in action, but embedded in stone, and still suggesting that this was a place where something was meant to enter, to exist, and to be understood in a way that goes beyond the physical form of the structure itself. The sacred courtyard by the ocean, on the island of Raiatea in French Polynesia, where the ocean extends endlessly beyond the reef, and the land is shaped by lush vegetation and volcanic ground. There is a place where stone has been arranged not to enclose space, but to define it in a way that feels open yet deeply intentional. This is Marae Taputapuatea. What makes this site unusual is not only its structure, but the way it functions without walls in the conventional sense, creating a space that is defined not by enclosure, but by arrangement, by boundaries that are visible yet not restrictive, forming a courtyard that remains connected to the surrounding environment. The central area consists of a large rectangular platform made from stone, carefully aligned and constructed to create a flat surface that serves as the focal point of the entire complex, surrounded by upright stones and additional features that mark its edges without isolating it from the land or the sea. And that openness matters, because it allows the space to remain connected to the sky, to the horizon, to the ocean beyond. And that connection is not accidental. It is part of the design. Because in Polynesian culture, places like this were not only physical locations, but points of interaction between people, nature, and belief, where ceremonies, gatherings, and decisions took place within a space that was both grounded and expansive. The placement of the marae along the coastline reinforces this relationship, positioning it in direct contact with the sea, which was central to navigation, movement, and connection between islands, creating a site that is both local and regional in its significance. And that significance extends beyond the island itself, because Marae Taputapuatea was part of a network of sacred sites across Polynesia, connected through shared traditions, knowledge, and systems of navigation that linked distant communities across vast ocean distances. And that network adds another layer, because now the site is not isolated, it is connected, part of a wider system. And that system is not defined by roads or walls, but by movement across the ocean, by routes that are invisible yet understood, linking places through knowledge and experience. The construction of the marae reflects this understanding. The stones are placed with care, forming edges, pathways, and focal points that guide movement within the space, creating a structure that is organized without being enclosed, allowing activity to flow while still maintaining definition. And that balance is important, because it shows that structure does not always require confinement. It can exist through arrangement, through alignment, through the way space is shaped rather than closed. Ceremonies conducted here would have involved groups of people gathering within the defined area, interacting with the space in ways that were guided by tradition, with specific positions, movements, and actions that gave meaning to the structure beyond its physical form. And that meaning is not fully visible today, but the layout still suggests it. The platform, the surrounding stones, the orientation toward the sea, all of it points to a system that was active, repeated, and understood by those who used it. And then there is the passage of time, because while the original practices are no longer carried out in the same way, the site itself remains, preserved as a cultural landmark that continues to hold significance, both historically and symbolically. The stones still define the space, the platform remains intact, the connection to the ocean is unchanged, and that continuity allows the site to retain its presence, even as its function has shifted. And maybe that is what makes Marae Tapatopotea stand out, because it shows that architecture does not always need to enclose or dominate space to be meaningful, that structure can exist in openness and connection in the relationship between elements, rather than in the boundaries that separate them. And even now, standing within the courtyard, with the ocean stretching beyond and the sky above, the sense of that connection is still present. Not contained, but defined. And still holding the outline of a place that was built not only to exist, but to bring together people, environment, and meaning into a single open space. The carved mountain of stone. In the foothills of the Bolivian Andes, where dense forests begin to merge with open highland terrain and the landscape shifts between elevation and depth, there is a site where the ground itself has been shaped in a way that does not resemble construction in the traditional sense, but something more direct, more permanent. This is Semepara Rock. What makes this place unusual is that it is not built from separate stones arranged together, but carved directly into a single, massive rock formation, a continuous surface that has been cut, shaped, and marked across a wide area, creating patterns that extend in multiple directions. From a distance, it appears as a large natural outcrop, rising slightly above the surrounding land, its surface uneven and weathered. But as you move closer, the carvings begin to emerge, lines, channels, and shapes that form a system across the rock. And that system is not random. The grooves run in defined paths, the shapes repeat. The surface holds patterns that suggest planning rather than erosion. And that immediately raises the central question. Why carve into the rock at this scale? Because shaping a surface this large requires sustained effort, repeated action, and a clear idea of what is being created, especially when the material itself is unbroken, meaning that every mark is part of the same continuous structure. And that continuity matters, because unlike built structures where elements can be added or replaced, carving into a single rock creates a design that is fixed from the beginning, where each decision affects the entire surface. And that suggests intention, not only in individual carvings, but in the overall layout. Some of the channels appear to guide water, suggesting a functional aspect where the movement of liquid across the surface was controlled or observed, possibly linking the carvings to environmental processes such as rainfall or seasonal flow. And that introduces a practical dimension, because now the rock is not only symbolic, it interacts with natural elements. It responds to water, and that interaction creates a dynamic system where the structure changes depending on conditions, even though the stone itself remains fixed. Other carvings form shapes that are less easily explained, including geometric patterns, carved seats, and areas that appear to have been smoothed for specific use, suggesting that the site served multiple purposes rather than a single function. And that multiplicity is important, because it shows that the rock was not used in a limited way. It was adapted, used differently across its surface. And that reflects flexibility. an understanding of how a single space can support multiple activities. The site has been associated with different cultures over time, including pre-Inca groups and later Inca presence, indicating that the location remains significant across periods, even as the specific use may have changed. And that continuity adds depth, because it shows that the site was not abandoned quickly. It was maintained, reinterpreted, integrated into different systems over time. And that kind of continuity is often a sign of importance, because places that continue to be used tend to hold meaning that extends beyond a single moment or group. The location itself contributes to that significance, positioned at a point where different ecological zones meet, creating a space that connects environments, cultures, and roots, making it a place of interaction as much as a place of construction. And that interaction may be part of the reason the site developed in this way, because carving into a central rock creates a fixed point, a reference, something that remains constant in a landscape that is otherwise changing. And that constancy can carry meaning, because it anchors activity, defines location, creates identity. And then there is the passage of time, because despite exposure to weather, erosion, and environmental change, the carvings remain visible, their patterns still clear enough to be recognized, even if their full purpose is not fully understood. And that endurance reflects something important, because the decision to carve into stone ensures that the structure cannot be easily removed or altered. It becomes part of the land, permanent. And that permanence allows the site to continue existing as a point of reference even after the original systems that used it have changed or disappeared. And maybe that is what makes Samaipata Rock stand out, because it represents a different approach to creating structure, one that does not build upward or outward, but inward, shaping the surface of the land itself to create something that is both functional and symbolic. And even now, standing on that rock, looking across the carved lines and the surrounding landscape, the sense of design is still present, not fully explained, but clearly intentional, and still holding the outline of something that was shaped with purpose across a surface that continues to carry those marks long after the hands that created them are gone, the chamber aligned with the winter sun. On the Orkney Islands, where the land is low, winds move constantly across the fields, and the sky often feels closer than it should. There is a structure that does not immediately reveal what it contains. From the outside, it appears as a grassy mound, rounded, still, almost indistinguishable from the natural rises in the surrounding terrain. But beneath that surface, there is precision. This is Meisho. And what makes it unusual is not just its age, but the way it was built with a level of alignment that suggests careful observation of the world beyond the ground itself. Dating back to around 2800 BCE, this chambered cairn belongs to a period when people began constructing spaces not just for burial, but for something more structured, something that connects the physical and the cyclical. The entrance is low and narrow, positioned in a way that forces a controlled movement into the structure. As you pass through, the passage extends inward, built from large stone slabs that form both the walls and the ceiling, creating a corridor that feels enclosed and deliberate. The further you move inside, the more the outside world begins to disappear. The light fades, sound softens, and the space narrows until it reaches the central chamber. And this chamber is not random in its design. It is square, balanced, constructed with large stones fitted together with precision, forming a space that holds its shape without the need for binding materials. And that precision matters, because this is not simply a hollow space beneath a mound. It is a defined interior, a place that was shaped intentionally. And that intention becomes even clearer when considering its alignment. Because during the winter solstice, as the sun sets on the horizon, light enters the passage and travels inward, reaching the central chamber and illuminating its interior. And that moment is not accidental. It happens once each year, at a specific time, under specific conditions, which means the structure was oriented with knowledge of that cycle. And that knowledge requires observation, not over a short period, but over years, tracking the movement of the sun, understanding its patterns, and then translating that understanding into construction. And that changes how the structure is understood, because now it is not only a burial site, it is a marker, a way of connecting the ground to the sky, a way of embedding time into stone. And that suggests a deeper layer of meaning, because the alignment creates an event, a moment when light enters a space that is otherwise dark. And that moment would have been predictable, expected, recognized. And that recognition could carry significance beyond function. Symbolic, ritual, connected to cycles of life, death, and renewal. And then there is the construction itself, because building something like this requires effort. The stones are large, heavy, transported and positioned with care. The passage is straight, the chamber is stable, and the entire structure is covered by a mound that protects it from above. And that protection has worked, because even after thousands of years, the interior remains intact. The alignment still functions. The structure still holds. And that endurance reflects something important, because whatever method was used to build it, it was effective, not temporary, but lasting. And then there is the later history, because long after its original use, the site was entered again. Vikings left markings on the walls, carvings that remain visible today, adding another layer to the structure's history. And that changes its identity, because now it is not only a Neolithic structure, it is a place that has been interacted with across different periods, reused, reinterpreted. And that continuity adds depth, because it shows that the structure did not disappear from awareness. It remained, recognized, even if its original meaning changed. And maybe that's what makes my show stand out, because it combines multiple layers of understanding: construction, alignment, time, and memory, all contained within a single structure. And even now, standing outside, looking at what appears to be nothing more than a mound, it is difficult to fully grasp what lies beneath. But inside, the structure remains, defined, precise, and still aligned with a moment that repeats every year, a moment where light enters darkness, exactly as it was designed to do.